Tonight, we're diving into the long, strange story of what really became of the darkest wizard of the age. The whole of it, from a frightened boy in a bleak orphanage to a broken thing curled on the floor of a quiet white station at the very end. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing to fear here, only a slow and even voice tracing the shape of a life that was spent, above all else, running away from death. If these long, quiet tellings are the ones that finally carry you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only small thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will follow, without haste, not just the man the world learned to fear, but the soul beneath him, the way it was torn again and again. The years he spent as little more than a shadow drifting in a far forest, the bodies he wore and lost, and the quiet final undoing of it all. You do not need to hold on to any of it, and none of it can reach you where you are. Let it move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, softly, down toward rest. Let us begin, as these long stories often must, on a cold night at the very end of the year, the 31st of December, in a plain gray building on a plain gray street, at a place called Wool's Orphanage. There was no comet that night, no sign in the sky, nothing that marked the hour as different from any other. Inside, a young woman lay dying on a hard bed, and beside her, wrapped in small, lay the son she had just brought into the world. She named him before she went. She called him Tom, for the father who had left her, and Marvolo, for her own father, and Riddle, again, for the man who was already gone. Then she closed her eyes, and did not open them again, and the boy who would one day be feared across the whole of the wizarding world began his life as an orphan, before the year itself had even finished turning. The woman's name was Gaunt, and though nobody at Wool's Orphanage would ever know it, she carried in her blood a line that reached all the way back to Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, a wizard who had lived nearly 1,000 years before her, and whose gift, the rare and famous ability to speak with serpents, had traveled quietly down through generations until it settled, faint and worn thin by poverty and pride, in her. The Gaunts by then were a family fallen very far from whatever grandeur they had once claimed, proud of a name that meant nothing anymore, guarding a locket and a ring as though those small things could still prove something to the world. Merope herself had grown up unloved and afraid in a house governed by a cruel father and a crueler brother. And when at last she found a way out, it came through a muggle man named Tom Riddle, handsome and wealthy and entirely unaware, at first, that anything unusual had touched his life at all. What passed between them was not a courtship in any ordinary sense, and by the time the truth of it faded, and Merope let him go free of whatever had bound him to her, he wanted nothing more to do with her, and he left before their child was ever born. He never saw his son's face, not once, not even in a photograph, and he never would have chosen to. So it was that Merope Gaunt walked, alone and heavy with child, into a muggle city she did not know, sold the last thing of value she owned, and made her way in the final days of December to the doorstep of Wool's Orphanage, where she gave birth, spoke her son's name aloud for the first and only time, and died. She had magic in her, though it had grown weak in her from grief and hardship, weak enough that some who study her life still wonder whether, in the end, she simply chose not to use it, worn down past the point of wanting to live. And so her son entered the world already marked by 2 absences, a father who had walked away before his birth, and a mother who could not stay past it. He would grow into a boy, and then a young man, who could not bear either kind of leaving, who feared more than anything else the second of those absences, the going out of life itself, though it would be many years before the shape of that fear became clear even to those who watched him most closely. The matron of Wool's orphanage gave him his mother's name for his first, and his grandfather's for his middle, though of course she knew nothing of the Gaunts or the Riddles or the strange thin line of magic that had brought this particular child through her door. To her, and to the staff who raised him, he was simply Tom, a child among many children, fed and clothed and given a bed in a long room with the others. But he was not, even from his earliest years, a child like the others. He did not cry the way infants cry. He did not reach for comfort the way children reach for it. He grew into a boy who kept his own company, who watched more than he spoke, who was polite in a careful, distant way that unsettled the women who cared for him more than open rudeness ever could have. He had no friends among the other orphans, not because none of them tried, but because something about him made trying feel unwise. The other children were afraid of him, in a way none of them could quite explain, even to themselves. And that fear only deepened as the years went on and stranger things began to happen around him. There was, for instance, the matter of animals. Tom seemed able to make them do exactly as he wished, without a leash, without a command spoken aloud, simply by wanting it. And more than once something happened to a creature that had displeased him. An incident with a boy named Billy Stubbs and his pet rabbit, found one morning hanging from a rafter in a way no rabbit could have managed on its own, though nothing was ever proven, and Tom only smiled his careful, closed smile when he was asked about it. There was a summer outing to the countryside when Tom took two of the younger children, a girl named Amy Benson and a boy named Dennis Bishop, into a cave along the shore, and the two of them came back changed, pale and frightened, refusing ever after to say what had happened inside, no matter how gently or how firmly they were asked. Small objects went missing from other children's shelves and reappeared, days later, hidden among Tom's own few belongings, not sold, not used. Simply kept, the way a magpie keeps things that catch its eye, trophies of a kind that meant something only to him. He could make things move without touching them. A marble rolling itself across a table, a door swinging shut on its own when he wished to be alone. He could hurt another child simply by wanting to, without ever raising a hand. And those he hurt this way learned quickly not to speak of it, because no mark was ever left that anyone else could see. And beneath all of this, quiet and constant, there ran something else. Something the staff noticed without quite having words for it. The boy asked, more than once, careful and unhurried questions about his mother's death, about what became of a person once they stopped breathing, about whether death was a thing that could be avoided if one were simply clever enough, or careful enough, or strong enough. He asked these questions the way other children asked about supper, without visible fear, and that flatness frightened the matron more than tears would have. It was in the autumn of the year he turned 11 that a visitor came to Wool's orphanage, an elderly man in an odd, old-fashioned coat, who introduced himself as a professor from a school called Hogwarts and asked to speak with the boy alone. Tom was suspicious of him from the first moment, certain, in the guarded way of a child who has learned never to trust kindness, that the man had come to send him somewhere worse, an asylum, a punishment, some reckoning at last for all the things he had done and never been caught doing. He accused the visitor of exactly that before the man had said more than a few words, and it took a small and careful demonstration, a flare of harmless fire set to an old wardrobe, where Tom kept his hoard of stolen little treasures. A yo-yo, a thimble, a mouth organ, none of them valuable, all of them taken, to make the boy sit still and listen. The fire did not frighten him the way it should have. It fascinated him. He understood, watching it, that the strangeness in himself had a name at last, and a place where it belonged, and he began, from that very afternoon, to want that place more than he had ever wanted anything. Up next in Chapter 2, The First Tearing of a Soul, we'll uncover what Tom Riddle carried with him through the gates of Hogwarts, and the quiet, curious question that would, in time, split his soul apart. The boy who arrived at Hogwarts that autumn carried nothing with him but a small trunk, a wand of yew and phoenix feather, and a hunger that no one at the castle ever quite managed to see. He had left behind the gray orphanage, the damp stairwells, the other children who feared him without knowing why. Here, at last, was a world built from the very thing he had always sensed within himself, and he moved through it as though he had simply been waiting, all those years, for someone to hand him the key to a house he already owned. He was sorted into Slytherin, the house of the ambitious and the cunning, and it fit him the way a well-made glove fits a hand-grown used to gloves. From his very first weeks, the teachers noticed him, not for mischief, but for a quiet, radiant competence that seemed to have no ceiling. He answered questions before they were fully asked. He mastered charms that older students still fumbled. He read ahead, and then read further still, until the library staff grew used to seeing his narrow shape bent over books far beyond his year. Professors spoke of him in the staff room with a kind of relieved delight, the way one speaks of a student who makes the whole tedious business of teaching feel worthwhile again. Handsome, softly spoken, endlessly polite. He gave each of them exactly what they wanted to see, and none of them thought to ask what he kept hidden beneath it. Among his fellow students, he built something that was not quite friendship, though it wore friendship's shape. A small circle gathered around him within his first year and never really left his orbit again. Boys drawn less by warmth than by the sense that standing near him meant standing near something powerful, something that might, one day, be worth having chosen early. He learned each of their weaknesses the way other boys learned Quidditch statistics, filing away a father's shame here, a sister's illness there, a private cruelty a classmate had once confessed and instantly regretted. He was patient with this knowledge. He rarely used it right away. He simply kept it, the way a man might keep coins in a drawer, trusting that a use would eventually present itself. But beneath the prefect's badge he would later wear, beneath the top marks and the teacher's quiet favoritism, a different kind of hunger was taking shape, and it had begun long before he ever set foot on the Hogwarts Express. Even as a small boy in the orphanage, Tom Riddle had understood, with a clarity that frightened the matrons who tried to comfort him, that people died. His own mother had died, leaving him nothing but a name and a locket he had never seen, and the thought of his own eventual end sat in him not as a distant abstraction, but as an intolerable insult, a rule he refused, from the very beginning, to accept applied to him. At Hogwarts, surrounded for the first time by real magic, he began to ask a question that most witches and wizards spent their whole lives choosing not to ask aloud. If magic could do so much, bend so many of the world's hard edges, why should death remain the one door it could never hold shut? It was in his search for an answer to that question that he first turned to the matter of his own blood. He had grown up believing himself ordinary, a friendless boy with an unremarkable surname, until the magic inside him proved otherwise. Now, hungry to know where such power had come from, he began digging through the school's records and the whispered histories of old wizarding families. The trail led him, eventually, to the name Gaunt, a small, decayed line that traced itself back, generation after shrinking generation, to Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of the school in which he now excelled. The discovery struck him with the force of a private revelation. He was not simply gifted, he was owed. The castle that had taken him in as a stranger was, in some deeper sense, his birthright, and the ordinary name his father had left him. A name he had always faintly despised no longer felt like his own at all. It was also somewhere in these years, quietly and without any single dramatic moment that his classmates could later point to, that he first encountered the darkest branch of magic ever recorded, a magic so thoroughly forbidden that most wizards never learned even its name. He read of a process by which a witch or wizard could tear off a fragment of the soul and conceal it inside an object, anchoring a piece of the self outside the body so that even if the body were destroyed, that fragment would remain, and the soul would not travel on to wherever souls are meant to go. Such an object was called a Horcrux, and the making of one required a single terrible act. It required murder, the deliberate taking of another life. The ultimate act of undoing that split the soul precisely because it was so fundamentally against nature. To a boy already convinced that death was an error to be corrected rather than a fact to be accepted, this was not a horror. It was an answer. He was 16 when he first put the idea into practice. Deep beneath the castle, hidden behind a sink in a girl's bathroom rarely used by anyone, lay a chamber that only the heir of Salazar Slytherin could open, sealed away since the founder's time, said to hold within it a monster capable of purging the school of those the founder had deemed unworthy of magic. Tom Riddle, alone among every student and teacher at Hogwarts in a generation, could open it, and in his 16th year, he did. From within its depths he released a basilisk, a serpent whose gaze alone could kill, and let it move through the ancient pipework of the castle at his quiet command. The creature's first victim was a girl named Myrtle, a student who had gone, tearful and unnoticed as always, into a bathroom stall to cry. She never saw what killed her. The castle was thrown into panic, and the threat of closure hung over the school Tom Riddle had come, by then, to think of as more truly his than anyone else's. Rather than risk that loss, rather than let suspicion drift anywhere near himself, he did what he had already shown, in 100 smaller ways, he knew how to do. He built a story, calm and convincing, and placed it in front of the one person least equipped to argue against it. He pointed the school's fear toward Rubeus Hagrid, a gentle, large-hearted boy a year above him, who had been quietly keeping an enormous, harmless acromantula named Aragog hidden in a cupboard, and let the staff believe that the spider, not the serpent, had been the thing stalking the corridors. Hagrid was expelled in disgrace, his wand snapped, his name attached for decades to a killing he had never committed, while the true culprit walked on through the castle with his prefect's badge polished and his marks untouched. And somewhere in the quiet after it was done, something in Tom Riddle gave way that would never again be whole. The soul does not simply witness a murder committed in cold calculation for the sake of power. It splits under the strain of it, a fracture no healer could ever mend, and a piece of what he had been broke free and went looking for somewhere to hide. He had already prepared a small, unremarkable diary to receive it, and into those blank pages, without ceremony, without anyone in the world yet knowing what had been done, the first fragment of his soul was sealed away forever. Up next in Chapter 3, A Diary, a Ring, a Locket, we'll uncover how that first hidden fragment of his soul learned to wait, and how Tom Riddle, still years from the name the world would come to fear, began searching for the next objects worthy of holding what little remained of him. When the diary was closed and hidden away, and the halls of Hogwarts had seen the last of Tom Riddle as a student, the young man who left the castle carried something new folded inside him, something quieter than pride and colder than ambition. A part of his soul now lived apart from his body, tucked into the pages of a small black book, and he had learned, in that single act, that the boundary between himself and death was not fixed after all. It could be moved, it could be widened. And so, in the long summer after his graduation, with a war gathering slowly across the wizarding world and no family waiting anywhere to welcome him home, Tom Riddle turned his attention to the only blood he had ever been able to trace, the blood of his mother. And he went looking for the Gaunts. He found them, or what remained of them, in a narrow valley in the English countryside, in a village called Little Hangleton, where two families lived within sight of each other and knew nothing of what bound them. On the hill above the village stood a grand house, handsome and well-kept, belonging to the wealthy Riddles. Down in the trees below, hidden almost entirely from the road, stood a shack of stone and rotting wood, its garden choked with weeds, a dead snake nailed above its door, like a warning to anyone who might wander too close. This was the house of the Gaunts, the last low branch of an old and once proud line, and it was here that Tom Riddle, wearing the calm and pleasant face he had already learned to wear so well, went to introduce himself to family he had never met. He met his uncle first. Morphin Gaunt was a wild, unwashed man, missing teeth, quick to anger, half feral from years alone in that ruined cottage, muttering to snakes in a hissing language that Tom Riddle, to his own quiet astonishment, understood without effort. For it was the same tongue that had opened the Chamber of Secrets and answered the call of the great serpent hidden beneath the castle he had just left behind. And yet this ragged, forgotten man wore, without ever knowing its worth, a heavy gold ring set with a black stone on his finger, a ring passed down through generations as the last surviving mark of a vanishing nobility. From this uncle, in a conversation that unsettled and thrilled him in equal measure, Tom Riddle learned the truth of his own beginning. He learned of his mother, Merope Gaunt, plain and overlooked, kept half a servant in her own home by a cruel father and a crueler brother. He learned that she had loved, from a distance, a handsome muggle boy who rode past the cottage on his horse, a boy named Tom Riddle, and that she had used what magic she had, some said a love potion, some said something darker still, to make him love her in return, if only for a time. He learned that when the magic failed, or was abandoned, the muggle Tom Riddle had looked at his wife with nothing but disgust, and had ridden away from her, and never once looked back, leaving her alone and pregnant in a filthy London street, where she would die within the hour of her son's birth, having given him, with her last words, his father's name and nothing else. It was, perhaps, the first time in his life that Tom Riddle heard his own history spoken aloud, and it did not move him toward grief. It moved him toward fury, a slow, deliberate fury, the kind that does not shout but simply plans. He had spent his childhood believing himself abandoned by nothing more than an ordinary father who did not want him. Now, he understood that he had been abandoned by a muggle, a man who had scorned magic itself, who had scorned the woman who loved him, who had left a wizard's son to grow up among muggles, who feared and misunderstood him. This, to Tom Riddle, was not simply a private sorrow. It was an insult to what he was becoming. He did not linger long with his uncle. He left the cottage that night and climbed the hill toward the grand house where the Riddles lived. And there, in rooms far finer than any the Gaunts had known in 100 years, he found his father, now an old man, and his father's parents, gathered together in comfort they had never once shared with him. What happened in that house has never been fully told, though its ending is known well enough. By morning, all three lay dead, killed by a curse that left no mark upon them. A killing so clean and so complete that the village would speak of it for years without ever understanding it. Before he left, Tom Riddle returned once more to his uncle's cottage, and there, with a skill few wizards his age could have managed, he reached into Morphin's mind and rearranged what he found there, planting a false and vivid memory of murder. A confession that was not a confession at all, but a story placed gently and permanently into a broken man's head. When the ministry came, as it eventually did, it was Morphin Gaunt who confessed. Morphin Gaunt who was taken away to Azkaban, and Morphin Gaunt who would spend the remainder of his life believing himself guilty of a crime that had never truly been his. Before he left that cottage for the last time, Tom Riddle took one thing from his uncle's hand. It was the gold ring, the one bearing the Gaunt crest, the mark of Peverell, of Slytherin, of everything ancient and noble that Tom Riddle believed himself entitled to inherit. He did not yet know what the ring truly held within its black stone, did not know that it was older and stranger than the bloodline it had marked for so long. He knew only that it was his by right, a piece of a legacy his mother's family had let rot in poverty, and he wore it home like a secret crown. The years that followed carried him quietly through the wizarding world, first through travel, then through work, until at last he came to stand behind the counter of Borgin and Burke's, a shop in Knockturn Alley that dealt in objects with long and often dangerous histories. It suited him well. He was polite, attentive, endlessly charming to the right customers, and it was there, in the course of his ordinary duties, that he came to know an old witch named Hepzibah Smith, a woman of enormous wealth and a weakness for flattery that Tom Riddle understood instinctively how to use. He visited her often. He admired her collection, listened patiently to her stories, made himself, over months, into something like a favorite. And in time, she showed him the two objects she prized above all others, a golden cup that had once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, and a locket, heavy and ornate, bearing a small emerald S, said to have belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself. Tom Riddle looked upon both with a hunger he kept carefully hidden behind his practiced smile. Though something in his face must have flickered, just for an instant, because Hepzibah Smith would later tell others, with a fond and foolish laugh, that her favorite young assistant seemed almost to covet her treasures more than her company. She meant it as a compliment. She never understood how close to true it was. Not long after, Hepzibah Smith was found dead in her home. A box of poisoned cocoa left beside her chair, and her elderly house elf was blamed and taken away. Confused and unable to explain what had truly happened to the mistress she had served so faithfully for so many years. The cup and the locket vanished quietly from the house that same night and were never seen in public again. Two founders' relics joined, in secret, a ring that held more than anyone yet knew, and a diary that had already tasted its first death. One by one, quietly, patiently, the pieces of something vast and terrible were being gathered. 4 objects for 4 founders. A collection assembled not for beauty or history, but for a purpose only its collector understood. A purpose that would, in the years to come, ask him to give up more of his own soul than any wizard before him had ever dared. Up next in Chapter 4, the man who unmade himself will uncover. By the time the locket and the diary and the ring had been gathered, hidden, and set upon their separate paths through the world, something in the young man who had made them had already changed. He was no longer merely a boy who feared death. He had become something colder and more deliberate, a mind that had tasted the making of a Horcrux once and found that it did not frighten him at all. It steadied him. And a mind like his, once steadied by an act that most witches and wizards would call unspeakable, does not stop at one. He returned to his studies with a new hunger. Hogwarts had given him charm, cunning, and the trust of his teachers, but it could not give him what he wanted now, which was certainty. He wanted to know, in exact and technical terms, what a soul was, how it could be broken, and how many pieces a single soul might endure being broken into before the breaking itself became a kind of death in life. He searched the restricted shelves of the library long after the other students had gone to bed. He read what little the school would allow him to read on the subject, and when the school's permission ran out, he looked elsewhere. In older books, in forbidden books, in the quiet corners of the castle, where a clever and well-liked student could go unquestioned. It was in this hunger that he came, one evening, to the rooms of Horace Slughorn, the potions master who had taken a particular liking to him, who saw in him ambition and talent and did not yet see, or perhaps chose not to see, what lay beneath. The conversation that passed between them that night was an ordinary one at first, wandering and companionable, the kind of talk a favored student might share with an indulgent teacher over a glass of mead. But slowly, carefully, the young man turned the conversation toward the subject that had consumed him. He asked about the darkest of magics. He asked, in a voice that tried very hard to sound like idle curiosity, about the splitting of a soul, about the objects in which a fragment of that soul might be hidden, about whether such a division could be done more than once. That conversation would be preserved, though neither man in the room that evening could have known it. It would be drawn out of the older man's memory many years later, altered by guilt and by time, and studied by others trying to understand what had been done and why. But even in its damaged and reluctant form, it carried the shape of that evening clearly enough. A brilliant, hungry young man asking the questions that no teacher should ever have to answer, and a teacher who answered them, not because he wished any harm, but because he could not quite refuse the boy in front of him. The young man left those rooms with what he needed. He now understood, more clearly than any living person outside a small and secretive circle of dark practitioners, exactly what it would take to tear his soul apart again and again, and roughly how far a soul could be torn before the person who carried it stopped, in any meaningful sense, being whole. He did not act at once. Whatever else he was patient, and he understood that acts of this magnitude required preparation and secrecy, and above all, purpose. The soul, once broken, could not be mended by ordinary means. Every fragment removed was a fragment lost, a piece of feeling and memory and self folded away into an object and left there, inert, waiting. He understood the cost. He chose to pay it anyway, and he would go on choosing to pay it, deliberately and with open eyes, for years to come. Where other dark wizards had flinched from the idea of dividing their souls even once, he came to see the horror of it as something to be mastered rather than avoided, a barrier that lesser minds respected, and that he, uniquely, could walk through and survive. It was around this same time, in his final years at school, that he began to reshape something else about himself. His name. He had always hated it. Tom was a common name, a name shared with 100 forgettable men, a name that carried nothing of grandeur and everything of the father who had abandoned his mother before he was even born, a muggle who had wanted nothing to do with the world the boy had grown to love. Marvolo was worse in its own way, an inheritance from a dying, filthy line of wizards who had let their blood run to ruin through poverty and inbreeding and spite. He did not want either name. He wanted a name that belonged to no one but himself, a name built rather than given, chosen rather than inherited. He found it in the letters of his own name, rearranged. Tom Marvolo Riddle became, with a small and exact magic, I am Lord Voldemort. He did not stumble upon this by accident. He worked at it, turning the letters over as carefully as he had turned over the theory of the Horcrux, until the anagram sat perfectly, until the new name announced itself as a kind of proclamation. He showed it to those around him with a showman's care, letting the letters rearrange themselves in the air before their eyes, watching their faces as the truth of it settled in. It was theater, and it was also a kind of vow. From that point on, he intended never again to answer to the name his father had left him. The transformation did not stop at a new name. Over the years that followed, as he made Horcrux after Horcrux, as fragment after fragment of his soul was carved away and hidden in the world, something in his face and body began, very slowly, to change as well. It was not sudden. Those who had known him at school would not have looked at him even a decade later and seen a monster. But the alteration was steady, and it did not reverse. His features lost their warmth first, then their softness, then, gradually, their humanity itself. The handsome young man who had charmed professors and classmates alike began to fade, and in his place something leaner, paler, and stranger took shape. A face built more of will than of flesh. It was as though the soul, damaged again and again, could no longer hold its body in a fully human shape, as though each act of division cost him not only feeling, but form. He did not mourn this. If anything, he seemed to regard his own vanishing humanity as proof of how far beyond ordinary wizards he had traveled. He had come, by then, to a philosophy that shaped everything he did, that death was not a natural end to be accepted with dignity, but the single greatest weakness a witch or wizard could possess. He looked with something close to contempt upon those who spoke of dying peacefully, who called it noble, who let it come for them without a fight. Such people, to his mind, were simply too weak or too foolish to resist. He intended to be neither. Every Horcrux was an act of defiance against the one force he had feared since he was a small, friendless boy, watching his fellow orphans die in a cold London institution. He would not die as they had. He would not die at all, if care and cunning and enough shattered pieces of his own soul could prevent it. By the time he left Hogwarts, he was no longer entirely the boy who had arrived there 11 years before, dazzled by magic and hungry for a family he had never had. He had built himself into something else, deliberately, piece by piece, the way another man might build a fortress. And a fortress, once built, needs a name of its own to stand behind. Up next in Chapter 5, shedding the name Tom Riddle, we'll uncover the moment he stepped fully into the identity he had made for himself, and what it cost the last living traces of the boy he had once been. Shedding the name Tom Riddle, the boy who had walked out of the Chamber of Secrets with a diary emptied of its secret and a heart emptied of anything resembling mercy, did not vanish overnight into the wizard the world would come to fear. He dissolved slowly, deliberately, the way frost creeps across a window pane until the glass no longer shows what lies beyond it. Tom Riddle left Hogwarts with top marks in every subject that mattered to him, and with a hunger that no examination could measure. He had already begun, in the last months of his final year, to understand that the name his father had given him was a chain, and chains, he had decided long before he ever set foot on the Hogwarts Express, were made to be broken. He did not go quietly into a career, as his classmates expected of him. He did not accept the offers whispered in his direction by teachers who mistook his brilliance for ambition of an ordinary kind. Instead, he disappeared. For a decade, the trail of Tom Riddle grew thin and then thinner still, a scattering of sightings across the continent that only later, when it was far too late to matter, would be gathered together and understood as a single unbroken journey. He crossed the sea first, drawn toward the old libraries of France, where forbidden texts were catalogued under false names and kept behind wards that yielded, eventually, to patience and charm in equal measure. He learned there is no lock that will not open for a mind willing to spend years studying its shape. From France, he moved onward, through the mountain villages of the German countryside, where old magic still clung to the soil and old families still remembered spells that had no place in any ministry-approved curriculum. He sat at the feet of hermits and outcasts, men and women who had been driven from their own communities for practicing arts too dark to name in polite company. And from each of them, he took what he needed and left nothing behind but a faint, unplaceable unease. He kept company, in those years, with creatures that most witches and wizards crossed the street to avoid, sharing fires with the vilest practitioners of the darkest magic that could be found on the continent, learning from them not out of desperation, but out of a cold, methodical curiosity that never once wavered. He was not searching for companionship. He was searching for knowledge, and he was patient enough to gather it one fragment at a time, from sources that would have horrified the professors who once called him their finest student. It was in these years that he began, quietly and without fanfare, to test the boundaries of what a soul could survive. He asked questions that made even the darkest of his teachers hesitate before answering. Questions about permanence, about division, about what might remain of a person if the very fabric of their spirit were torn and hidden away in pieces. He asked as though the questions were academic. They were not. Somewhere in a hidden pocket of Albania, tucked among the black trees of a forest that history had otherwise forgotten, he found a stillness that suited him. A quiet so complete that he would return to it again and again in the years that followed, though none of his contemporaries yet knew to look for him there. It was a place without eyes, without memory, without judgment, and it would come, in time, to mean far more to him than any of them could have guessed. A refuge before it was ever a ruin. A hiding place before it was ever a grave for what remained of him. He told no one of the forest, not then and not for many years afterward. It was his alone, a secret folded away long before he understood how desperately he would one day need it. The way a careful man sets aside a single coin from every payment without knowing which winter it will be spent to survive. Eventually, as all wanderers must, he came home. England received him without ceremony, and he preferred it that way. He did not return as a hero or a scholar seeking recognition. He returned as a shopkeeper's assistant, and he chose his shop with the same precision he had once chosen his victims. Borgin and Burke's, tucked into the crooked heart of Nocturne Alley, dealt in the sort of objects that respectable wizarding families preferred not to discuss above a whisper. Cursed jewelry, blackened hands, cabinets that swallowed sound. It was the perfect vantage point. Every fading pure-blood family in Britain eventually found its way through that door, clutching some heirloom it could no longer afford to keep. And Tom Riddle, polite and unfailingly attentive, was there to greet them. He learned their names. He learned their grievances, their fears of a world that seemed to be slipping away from them, their bitterness toward a society that no longer bowed automatically to the old bloodlines. He listened with the practiced patience of a man laying the foundation of a house whose final shape only he could see. He flattered where flattery was useful, and he withheld it where silence would do more. Behind the counter of that shop, amid the dust and the whispered curses of 1,000 cursed trinkets, he built something far more valuable than any object on its shelves. He built trust. He built the beginning of a name that was not yet Voldemort, but was already something other than Tom. Elderly witches who had never once trusted a stranger found themselves confiding in the pale, courteous young man behind the counter, telling him of treasures locked away in family vaults of heirlooms too precious and too dangerous to sell to anyone else. He remembered every word. He forgot nothing. What others mistook for idle conversation was, for him, the slow and careful drawing of a map, one he intended to walk in full someday, whatever the cost to those who had trusted him along the way. The old school ties served him well. Former Slytherins, who remembered the quiet, clever boy from their house, began to hear of a man who spoke their language, who understood what they had lost and what they still believed they deserved. Men like Avery and Lestrange, sons of families whose fortunes had not kept pace with their pride, found in him something they had been waiting for without knowing its name. Others followed in their wake. Mulciber, Knott, Rosier, young men raised on stories of a purer, more powerful age that none of them had ever actually lived to see. And each one arrived already primed to believe whatever he offered them. He offered them not comfort, but purpose, the promise that the world could be remade to fit the shape they had always believed it should have taken. He spoke of blood as though it were destiny, of purity as though it were a birthright under siege. And he did it so convincingly that few of them ever paused to ask why a man who called himself their leader had chosen so carefully to erase every trace of the Muggle father whose blood ran through his own veins. The gatherings began small, a handful of former classmates meeting in private rooms, in the back parlors of old manor houses whose owners no longer asked too many questions about who came and went after dark. He gave them a symbol before he gave them a war, a mark that would one day burn into flesh as easily as it now settled into conversation, a promise disguised as belonging. Slowly, methodically, the way he had once memorized the layout of the Chamber of Secrets stone by stone, he assembled his following. He tested loyalty before he rewarded it. He discarded those who hesitated and drew closer those who did not. Fear became, for those nearest to him, indistinguishable from devotion, and he cultivated both with the same careful hand. By the time the wider wizarding world thought to notice him, the name Tom Riddle had already been buried, quietly and completely, beneath something colder. Whispers began to travel through Britain of a rising power that called itself Lord Voldemort. A name spoken first in curiosity and then, before long, in the hushed, careful tones reserved for things people were afraid to summon simply by speaking of them. The machinery of terror he had spent a decade constructing in silence was ready now to turn, gear against gear, toward the war that would define a generation. The wandering had ended. The shaping of an army had begun. Up next in Chapter 6, Master of the First War. We'll uncover, close your eyes, and let the years pass slowly, the way they truly did, one dark season folding into the next until more than a decade had gone by. The small circle that had gathered around him, those first followers who knelt in a candlelit room and rose again as something other than themselves, did not stay small for long. Word traveled quietly through the wizarding world, the way frightening things always do, and one by one, others came to kneel as well. They took his mark upon their forearms, a design burned into skin that would never fully fade. And they took, too, the name he gave them. Death Eaters, they were called, and soon that name would be spoken in the same hushed breath as his own, if it was spoken at all. What followed was a war, unlike any the wizarding world had known in living memory, though calling it a war does not quite capture its shape. There were no armies meeting on open fields, no lines drawn across a map. There was only a slow, spreading dread, a violence that came at night and by surprise, striking a family in their home. A traveler on a lonely road, a shopkeeper closing up for the evening. It went on for 11 long years, and in all that time, the wizarding world never once felt safe. He chose his targets with a coldness that his followers came to admire and imitate. Those born to parents without magic, the ones called Muggle-borns, he considered unworthy of the gifts they carried, thieves of a birthright that was not theirs by blood. And so families with names too ordinary, too unconnected to the old magical lines, learned to fear a knock at the door after dark. But it was not only them. Wizards and witches from ancient families as old and storied as his own mother's, found themselves marked for death simply because they refused to bow, because they sheltered those he despised, because they said, quietly, that his cause was wrong. His own kind turned on their own kind, and the word for what they had become spread through drawing rooms and ministry corridors alike. Blood traitors, they were named, as though loyalty to decency were itself a kind of betrayal. After each attack, those left behind would look up into the night sky and see it there, hanging above the rooftops or the treetops, vast and green and terrible. A skull, wrought from something that was not quite smoke and not quite light, with a serpent easing its way out through the open jaw. The Dark Mark, it came to be called, and in time, people learned that wherever it appeared, death had already come and gone. It became a kind of language all its own, a signature written across the sky so that no one could mistake whose hand had done the work below. Some said he conjured it himself in those early years, delighting in the way it made whole villages fall silent. Others said his followers were taught to send it up as soon as the deed was done, a small cruelty added to a larger one, so that grief would always be accompanied by that particular sickly green light. Fear settled over the wizarding world like a fog that would not lift. It crept into ordinary conversations, into the way people glanced over their shoulders in Diagon Alley, into the way owls were watched a little too closely as they crossed the sky, in case they carried news no one wished to receive. Shops closed earlier than they once had. Children were kept home from visits to friends a few streets over, and even the busiest families found reasons to stay indoors once the light began to fade. It was the kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly, but simply becomes part of daily life, until an entire generation of witches and wizards could not quite remember what it had felt like to walk home after dark without listening for footsteps behind them. And strangest of all, perhaps, was what happened to his name. It began quietly, a hesitation before certain syllables were spoken, and grew until whole families refused to say it at all, as though the sound itself might summon him closer. They called him other things instead, careful, roundabout things, or simply let their voices trail into silence where his name should have been. He knew this, of course, and it pleased him more than almost anything else his followers could offer. A name too feared to speak aloud was, in its own way, a kind of immortality, the very thing he had always wanted most. Not everyone bowed their heads and looked away, though. There was a wizard, old even then, silver-bearded and quiet-eyed, who had watched this rising darkness with a patience that unsettled even his allies. Albus Dumbledore had known, long before most others were willing to admit it, exactly what was gathering strength beyond the edges of ordinary life. And so he did what he had always done in the face of danger. He gathered people to him. Aurors and healers, teachers and shopkeepers, men and women who had nothing in common except a refusal to let fear decide how they would live. He called this gathering the Order of the Phoenix, and though its members worked mostly in secret, moving through the war like shadows within shadows, their presence meant that his enemy no longer moved entirely unopposed. Every attack he ordered was met, somewhere, by someone willing to stand in the way. Still, for every stand the Order made, there were losses that could not be undone. Names would be spoken for years afterward in careful, sorrowful tones, families broken beyond any mending. Among them, in time, would be a young couple named Longbottom, whose fate at the hands of some of his most devoted followers would become one of the darkest chapters the wizarding world ever had to carry. Though that particular sorrow belonged to a knight still some distance ahead in this story. For now, it is enough to know that no family, however brave, however skilled in magic, could be entirely certain they were safe. Horrors from the Ministry of Magic worked themselves past exhaustion trying to catch him, and time after time he slipped from their grasp, as though the laws that bound other wizards simply did not apply to him in the same way. And in truth, by this point in his life, he had begun to believe they did not. Each escape, each victory, each terrified silence that followed the mention of his name fed something in him that had been growing since he was a boy who feared the ordinary end that came to ordinary people. He had torn his soul apart to guard against death, had built himself into something more than a man. And now, watching an entire world flinch at the sound of 2 syllables, he allowed himself to believe he was already close to untouchable. His followers certainly believed it. They spoke of him in tones usually reserved for gods, not men, and he did nothing to correct them. Why would he, when the proof seemed to surround him on every side? He was, by most reckonings, the most powerful and most feared wizard of his age, a man who had reshaped an entire society's knights into something to be endured rather than enjoyed, and he wore that reputation the way another man might wear a crown. But even the most careful student of magic, even the most powerful sorcerer of his generation, does not always see everything that is coming. Somewhere in those long years of terror and triumph, a set of words had already been spoken, quietly, in a small room above a village inn, words that would matter more than any battle he had yet fought. He did not know it yet. He would not know it for a little while longer. But the shape of his ending, and the shape of a boy not yet born who would one day carry it, had already begun to take form, far from the reach of any dark mark, in a prophecy he had not yet heard. Up next in Chapter 7, the prophecy he chose to believe will uncover. By the time the war had reached its cruelest season, fear had become an ordinary weather over Britain, something people simply lived inside, the way one lives inside a long winter. Families locked their doors before dusk. Owls were watched with suspicion. Even the brave grew careful with their words, because words, in those years, could be the last ones a person ever spoke. It was into this tired, watchful darkness that something small and strange happened, so quiet that almost no one alive that night would ever know it had happened at all. It began in a dim upstairs room above a shabby little inn in Hogsmeade, the kind of place with a dusty goat's head swinging over its door and a landlord who asked few questions. Albus Dumbledore had come there for what seemed, on its surface, a very ordinary reason. He was interviewing a candidate for the position of divination teacher at Hogwarts, a wispy, distracted woman named Sybil Trelawney, who wore too many shawls and too many beads and who spoke, that evening, mostly of great-grandmothers and inner eyes and gifts she was quite sure she possessed, though little in the interview so far had suggested she possessed them at all. Dumbledore listened politely and patiently, the way he listened to nearly everyone, giving her every chance to surprise him. Nothing in the conversation so far had done so. He was, by all appearances, prepared to end it kindly and send her on her way with warm words and no offer of a post. And then, without warning, everything about her changed. Her voice dropped and hardened into something that was not quite her own. Her eyes, usually darting and unfocused, went perfectly still. In that altered voice, She spoke of one approaching who would have the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, a child born to parents who had defied him 3 times. Born as the 7th month died. She spoke of a mark the Dark Lord would place upon this child, a mark that would make them equals, and of a power the child would carry that the Dark Lord himself did not know. She spoke of an ending in which neither could go on living while the other survived, and she said again that the one who could vanquish the Dark Lord would be born as the 7th month died. Then, as quickly as it had come, the strangeness left her. She blinked and continued the interview as though nothing at all had occurred, seeming to remember none of it. Dumbledore, however, remembered every word. He understood, in that dim little room above the inn, that he had just witnessed something no one arranges and no one predicts on purpose, a true prophecy, spoken by a woman who did not know she had spoken it. What Dumbledore did not know, not that night, was that the room had not been quite so private as it seemed. Downstairs, at the bar, a young man in a traveling cloak had been listening at the door, drawn there by curiosity or instinct or simple bad luck. His name was Severus Snape, and he was already, by then, sworn to Voldemort's service. He caught only the opening of the prophecy, the part naming a child born as the 7th month died to parents who had defied the Dark Lord 3 times. Before the innkeeper caught him crouched at the door and threw him bodily out into the night. He never heard the rest, never heard of the mark, or the shared power, or the fate that bound the two so completely that one would have to fall for the other to live. He carried away only a fragment, but a fragment was more than enough to set something terrible in motion. He went to his master with what he had heard, and Voldemort listened the way he always listened to news of prophecy and power, hungrily, leaning into every word, and with the particular stillness of a man deciding how afraid to be. It was a small fragment to build a fear upon, a handful of broken lines torn out of a much larger prediction. Yet, Voldemort had never needed very much to build a fear upon. He had spent a lifetime turning small signs into large convictions. A prophecy naming a child who could destroy him was not a thing he could leave unexamined. He had spent his whole life building distance between himself and death, and here was a rumor suggesting death might yet reach him after all, wearing the face of an infant not even born. He set about learning who this child might be. As it happened, there were 2 boys born that summer who matched the words Snape had brought him, both arriving as July gave way to August, both born to parents who had stood against Voldemort not once, but 3 times over. Both families active in the resistance gathered around Dumbledore. One boy was Neville Longbottom, born to Frank and Alice Longbottom, Aurors who had crossed Voldemort's path more than once and lived to tell of it. The other was Harry Potter, born to James and Lily Potter, who had likewise defied him repeatedly and refused, again and again, to bow. Voldemort turned the choice over in his mind the way he turned over every choice, weighing it for advantage, for danger, for what it might mean about himself. And in the end, curiously, it was not blood purity that decided him, though blood was the very doctrine he preached to his followers and used to bind them to him. Neville was the pure-blood child, born to 2 parents of old wizarding lines, exactly the kind of heir his own rhetoric might have pointed him toward. Harry was not. Harry's mother had been Muggle-born, which made the boy, by the very measure Voldemort demanded of others, impure. And yet it was Harry he chose to fear. Harry he chose to name as the one, because somewhere beneath the doctrine, Voldemort recognized something of his own reflection in that particular child. A boy who would grow up as he had, between 2 worlds, neither wholly of the wizarding world nor separate from it. He believed, without quite admitting why, that the more dangerous rival would be the one who most resembled himself. It was, though no one could have told him so that night, the first great error of his war. Dumbledore would say, long afterward, that the prophecy alone had never bound anyone to anything, that it was Voldemort's own choice, and Voldemort's choice alone, that gave the words their power over him. Had he ignored what Snape brought him, had he let the matter rest, the future might have unfolded so differently that no story would ever have needed telling about it. But he did not let it rest. He could not. Fear, once it finds a name to attach itself to, rarely allows itself to be set down again, and Voldemort had feared death too long and too hard to leave any rumor of his own ending unexamined. So he made his decision and turned the full weight of his attention and his followers toward one family. James and Lily Potter and their infant son became, from that night forward, the most hunted family in Britain. Word reached them, through allies still loyal to Dumbledore's cause, that Voldemort had marked them for death, and they did what few families in their position could still manage to do. They vanished. With help from those they trusted most, they placed themselves under the protection of the Fidelius Charm, a spell so complete that their home could be hidden inside a single secret, sealed inside the mind of one chosen friend, invisible to any searcher, however powerful, unless that one friend chose to tell. For a time, it seemed to work. Voldemort searched and found nothing. The Potters lived on in their hidden cottage, small and quiet and, for a while, almost safe. While outside their walls, the war went on turning, and the Dark Lord, who had chosen to fear a child, kept hunting for the door he could not see. Up next in Chapter 8, The Curse That Turned Back, we'll uncover the night the hidden door was finally found, and what happened when the curse Voldemort had prepared for a sleeping child turned back upon the one who cast it. By the last week of October, the trail had narrowed to a single trembling thread, and that thread had a name. Peter Pettigrew had been friends with James Potter since their first train ride to Hogwarts, one of 4 boys who had grown up believing themselves inseparable. And it was Peter, small and anxious and always a little behind the others, who the Order chose almost by accident to hold the Potters' greatest secret. Sirius Black had suggested it himself, reasoning that no one would suspect the quiet, unremarkable friend when everyone would expect the secret to rest with him. It was meant to be a clever misdirection. Instead, it became the hinge on which everything turned. Peter had been afraid for a long time before that October. He had watched the war-swallow names he recognized, Aurors and shopkeepers and whole families disappearing between one daily prophet and the next. And somewhere in that slow accumulation of fear, he had decided that survival mattered more than loyalty. He went to the ones he was supposed to be hiding from, and he gave them what they wanted most in the world. He did not need to be tortured for it, and he did not need to be threatened. He simply arrived, and he spoke, and in speaking he became a secret keeper who kept nothing at all. The cottage in Godric's Hollow had seemed, for a few short months, like a place outside the war entirely. It was small and crooked and full of ordinary things, baby clothes drying by the fire, a broom leaning by the door, a nursery painted the soft yellow of something hopeful. James Potter had grown restless indoors, a man built for movement now confined to small rooms for his own protection. But he bore it because Lily asked him to, and because upstairs, in a cot beneath the window, there was a reason worth any amount of restlessness. Their son had just turned 15 months old. He had his mother's eyes and, some said, his father's inability to sit still. On the night of the 31st of October, with the Fidelius Charm still wrapped around the cottage like an unbroken promise, the wards should have made the house impossible to find. No map could have located it. No amount of searching would have led anyone down that particular lane to that particular gate. But a secret is only as strong as the person keeping it, and the person keeping this one had already sold it. When the gate creaked open that evening under a hand that was not Peter's, it opened because Peter had told it where to be found. He came alone, as he preferred to. There was no grand procession, no army of masked followers trailing behind him through the dark village, only a tall, pale figure moving without hurry up the garden path, because he had waited a long time for this and saw no reason to rush its final steps. The house sensed nothing until the moment the front door was blown from its hinges, and by then there was no more time for wards or warnings, only for the desperate arithmetic of seconds. James Potter heard the door go and understood immediately what it meant. He shouted up the stairs for Lily to run, to take their son and go, and then he turned to face the hallway with nothing but his bare hands, because his wand had been left carelessly in the sitting room, a small, ordinary mistake that would cost him everything. He did not hesitate. He put himself between the stairs and the front door, unarmed, and he stayed there long enough for 2 words to be spoken and a flash of green light to fill the narrow hall. James fell where he stood, and the house went quiet in the particular way that only a house can go quiet after something irreversible has happened inside it. Upstairs, Lily had heard him shout, and she had heard what came after. She did not try to flee through a window or bargain for time she did not have. She gathered her son from his cot and stood between him and the door. And when the same tall figure came up the stairs and into the nursery, he found not a fleeing mother, but a standing one, refusing to move, refusing even to be reasoned with. He told her, in the flat, almost bored tone of a man who did not expect resistance from someone so plainly overmatched, that she had no need to die, that he had no quarrel with her, that all he required was the child. She was offered her life. She did not take it. She begged instead for her son to be spared in her place, and when the offer was not withdrawn, but simply repeated, she refused again, and again, standing in front of the cot with her arms spread, as though a body alone could stop what was coming. It could not, and yet in its way, it did something far stranger than stopping it. He killed her where she stood, because she would not step aside, because in the end, she made herself the only obstacle between her son and a curse that had never once failed to end a life. And then, with the nursery lit by nothing but the glow off a fallen wand, he turned to the cot and looked down at a child too young to understand what was happening to him, and he raised his wand a second time, certain, as he had been certain of very little else in his life, that this small final task would take only a moment. He spoke the same 2 words that had felled James in the hallway and Lily on the nursery floor. The light came again, green and total, arrowing down toward a boy who could not have run even if he had understood the need to. But something old was already in that room, older than any curse Voldemort had ever learned, and it did not announce itself with light or sound. It was simply there, woven into the child by the manner of his mother's death, by a sacrifice freely chosen with a love that asked nothing in return. The curse struck it and did not pass through. It turned back. What happened next was never fully witnessed, because there was no one left conscious to witness it, but the wreckage told its own story. The curse that should have ended a life ended something else instead. The body that had walked up that garden path only minutes before did not walk back down it. It came apart, undone by its own magic reflected home, leaving nothing behind in the nursery but scorched wood, a fallen wand, and a stillness that had not been there an hour earlier. But a body is not the same thing as a soul, and this particular soul had spent years making certain it could not be so easily disposed of. Torn already into pieces hidden far from harm's reach, It could not be destroyed along with the flesh it had been wearing. It was only cast out of that flesh, violently and without ceremony, reduced in an instant from the most feared wizard in Britain to something that had no shape at all, something that fled the ruins of that house, with nothing left to call a body and barely enough left to call a self. In the cot, the child lived. He had taken only the faintest edge of a curse built to kill outright, and it left him with nothing worse than a single thin cut above his right eye, shaped, oddly, like a bolt of lightning. He would carry it for the rest of his life, a small mark from a very large night, and he would grow up not remembering any of it, not his mother's arms, not her voice, not the green light that should have been the last thing he ever saw. Up next in Chapter 9, Less Than the Meanest Ghost, we'll uncover what became of the thing that fled that nursery with no body left to wear, and where it went to hide from a world that believed, for the first time in over a decade, that it was finally safe. The nursery at Godric's Hollow had gone quiet, where a curse had rebounded and torn a body from its soul. There was nothing left that the eye could find. No cloak crumpled on the floorboards, no wand fallen from a hand, no shape stretched across the cot where a child slept on, marked but breathing. The house stood broken and silent under the stars, and somewhere within that silence, in a place with no walls and no name, something that had once called itself Lord Voldemort continued, in the barest, thinnest sense of the word, to exist. It was not life as anything living would recognize it. There was no heartbeat to keep time, no lungs to draw breath, no skin to feel the cold October air drifting through the shattered window. There was only a fragment of will, stripped of every comfort a body offers, clinging to the world the way a drowning thing clings to a splinter of wood. In the years that followed, when he had flesh again and followers kneeling before him in a moonlit graveyard, he would describe this very hour to them himself, in a voice grown used to command, and he would call it something quieter than any of his usual cruelties. He would say that he had become less than the meanest ghost. No house to haunt, no portrait to inhabit, only a consciousness and a hunger and the long work of not quite dying. For a wizard who had spent decades convincing himself and the wizarding world that death was an obstacle to be outwitted, an inconvenience meant for lesser minds, this was the deepest possible humiliation. He had split his soul again and again, hiding pieces of himself away in objects far from his own body, precisely so that a moment like this one could never undo him completely. In that, at least, the plan had held. He had not died, not truly, not in the way James and Lily Potter had died that same night. But he had been reduced past anything he could have imagined, thinned to something that could not lift a hand, could not speak a word aloud, could not so much as stir the dust in an empty room. The immortality he had purchased at such a terrible price had bought him only this: an endless, formless waiting, with no promise that the waiting would ever end. There was no sleep in that state, and so there was no rest from it either. A ghost, at least, keeps some memory of the shape it once wore, some echo of a voice, some habit of walking a familiar corridor at the same hour every night. He had none of that. He was thought without a throat to give it sound, hatred without a fist to make it felt, a will as sharp as it had ever been, and utterly unable to act on anything at all. What remained of him simply endured, caught somewhere between the living world and whatever lies past it, unable to join the dead and unable to return to the living. While he drifted, unseen and unfelt, the world he had built began to come apart above him. For the better part of 2 wars, his name had been enough to empty a street. Wizarding families had refused to say it aloud, choosing instead to speak of you-know-who, or he who must not be named, as though the syllables themselves carried some of his power. His Death Eaters had moved through the night in white masks, and behind them had come vanished neighbors, burned houses, and a green light that everyone learned to fear before they ever learned to name it. It had seemed, for a long while, that nothing could touch him. And then, in the space of a single evening, in a small house in a small village that no one outside it had ever thought important, all of that had ended. Word spread quickly once the first Aurors reached Godric's Hollow, and it did not take long to travel further still, out across the country, into ministries and marketplaces and quiet kitchens where families had stopped believing that good news of this kind was still possible. The most feared dark wizard in living memory was gone. Whether he was dead or merely vanished, no one could say for certain, and for a time, very few cared to ask too closely. What mattered was that the terror had lifted, that the killing curse had failed, and that it had failed against a child not yet 2 years old, a boy with a lightning-shaped scar and messy black hair, who had somehow lived through the one curse that was not supposed to have a survivor. His name, before that autumn, had belonged only to his parents and to the small circle who loved him. Afterward, it belonged to everyone. Harry Potter became a name spoken in toasts raised in pubs from one end of the country to the other, a name printed above stories in the Daily Prophet, a name whispered by strangers who had never met him and never would, all of them certain they understood what he had done, when in truth, he had done nothing at all but survive. He would grow up not remembering any of it, not the curse, not the green light, not the mother who had died protecting him. And yet he would carry the fame regardless, a boy known everywhere as the one who had lived, weighed down by an event too young in his memory to feel like his own. Elsewhere, among those who had once worn masks and knelt in circles beneath his orders, there was no toasting and no celebration. There was only the scramble of people trying to save themselves. Some were found and taken quickly, dragged before hurried trials and sent to Azkaban, where the dementors that guarded its walls would draw the warmth from them for years without end. Others were cleverer, or luckier, or simply better rehearsed in the art of sounding innocent. They stood before the Visengamote and swore, with tears that may or may not have been real, that they had never wanted any part of what they had done, that they had been under the imperious curse the entire time, forced to watch their own hands commit acts they would never have chosen. Some of these claims were believed, some of them were even true. Many were not, and the wizards who made them walked free regardless, folding themselves back into ordinary lives, resuming old professions, sending their children to school, waiting, though few would have admitted it even to themselves, to see whether the silence would ever be broken. A small number never bothered with such performances at all. A handful of his most devoted followers refused to deny him, even with Azkaban waiting on the other side of their trial, even with every incentive in the world to simply say the words that would have set them free. They said instead that they had searched for him and would go on searching, that they believed he would return, and the court sent them to the fortress in the North Sea along with all the rest. Whether this was loyalty or delusion, the wizarding world did not much care to examine. It filed them away as dangerous and turned its attention back to healing. The wizarding world, for its part, wanted very much to believe that it was over. There is a particular relief that comes after a long fear finally lifts, a lightness that makes people eager to close the door and never open it again. Ministries issued statements. Newspapers ran their headlines. Families who had lost someone lit candles and grieved properly for the first time in years, no longer looking over their shoulders while they did it. Children born in the months after that October night would grow up hearing his name only in old stories, spoken the way one speaks of a storm that has long since passed. He had been powerful. Yes, he had been terrible. Yes. But he was gone. And the world had survived him. And that, everyone agreed, was the end of the matter. It was not the end of the matter. It was only the beginning of the longest, quietest chapter of his existence. One with no followers, no wand, no name spoken with fear. Nothing at all but a drifting, starving awareness with nowhere to rest and nothing solid to hold. Years would pass in that condition, more than a decade of them, while the world above moved on entirely without him, forgetting, healing, raising a boy who did not know he was being watched for. He could not have told anyone, had there been anyone to tell, how long an hour felt with no body to measure it in. He could only continue, thin and formless, and patient in the one way that had never failed him, waiting for a crack of opportunity to open somewhere in the dark. Up next in Chapter 10, the long exile in the forests will uncover. After the ruin at Godric's Hollow, there was no coffin, no funeral, no grave to mark where he had fallen. There was only an absence, and inside that absence, something that still refused to call itself finished. What remained of him could not be called a man anymore. It could barely be called a spirit. It was a fragment of will wrapped around a scrap of breath, drifting without a body to carry it, without a voice to name itself with. And yet, it did not dissolve. It endured, the way a coal endures under ash long after the fire seems to have gone out, waiting only for something to fan it back to life. He had no strength left to cross oceans or seek out old allies. He had no strength, in truth, to do anything but hide. So he went where the world was thinnest, where no wizard would think to look for the greatest dark wizard of the age, and where the silence of empty land might let him gather himself without being found. He went east, into the wilds of Albania, into forests so old and so remote that even the trees seemed to have forgotten the names of kings and ministries alike. It was there, far from Britain and its rejoicing, that he began the longest and loneliest chapter of his existence. Nearly a decade of hiding as barely more than a whisper of malice drifting through undergrowth and shadow. The forests offered him nothing kind. They offered him only distance, and distance was, for the first time in his life, exactly what he needed. No one hunted a wizard who did not exist. No one searched for a shape that could not be seen. In the world he had left behind, his name had become something to whisper only in fear. Then, slowly, only in memory. Horrors stood down. Families put away their photographs of the missing and the dead. The wizarding world exhaled, believing itself finally free. He, meanwhile, existed nowhere on any map, sustained by nothing but the refusal to stop existing. To survive at all, he needed a body, even a poor one, even one utterly unworthy of what he had been. And so he learned to do what he had never imagined he would be reduced to doing. He crept into the minds of animals. A serpent gliding through damp leaves might feel, for a moment, a colder and more purposeful will settle behind its eyes. A bird startled from a branch might fly a little further than instinct demanded, driven by something that was not quite its own hunger. He slipped into foxes, into owls, into the small, quick creatures of the forest floor, wearing them the way a man might wear a coat 2 sizes too small, cramped and ill-fitting, and entirely without dignity. It was, by any measure, a wretched existence. The wizard who had once commanded fear across an entire nation, who had broken families and toppled resistances, who had believed himself destined to outlast death altogether, now measured his days by how long a rabbit's heartbeat could sustain him before the small body failed, and he was forced to abandon it and search for another. There was no throne in this exile, no followers, no whispered title. There was only hunger and cold and the slow crawl of seasons through a forest that did not know or care what he had once been. Snow came and buried the undergrowth where he hid, and thawed and came again, and still no rescue arrived, because he had made certain that none of his followers knew where to look, and because most of them, in any case, had long since told themselves he was gone for good. Any lesser will would have broken under the weight of that humiliation. Any ordinary spirit would have surrendered to the plain, undramatic fact of death rather than endure such reduction. But he was not, and had never been, ordinary in his terror of dying. That terror, which had shaped every choice of his life since boyhood, did not weaken in the forests of Albania. If anything, it hardened into something purer, a patience with no bottom to it. He did not rage against his condition, not where anyone could see, and there was no one to see. He simply waited, turning the problem over and over the way a prisoner turns over the one loose stone in his cell wall, searching for the give in it. He was not alive in any way the word usually meant, but he had not died. And so long as that remained true, the possibility of return remained true as well. Every wretched night in an animal's skin was, to him, not defeat, but delay. He counted the years the way other creatures count nothing at all, patient in a way that had long since stopped being a virtue, and become instead an obsession with no edges. He knew, even in his diminished state, what he was searching for. He needed followers who still believed, or could be made to believe again. He needed knowledge that had been sealed away by those who feared exactly what he might do with it. Above all, he needed a body, living flesh he could bend to his purpose, not borrowed for a night from a fox or an owl, but held, sustained, controlled. Nothing in the deep forest could offer him that. The creatures there were too weak, too fleeting, too far from the world of wands and spellbooks where his true power had always lived. A snake could carry him for a season, an owl for a little longer, but neither could hold a wand, or read a book, or walk into a library and ask the right question of the right shelf. He needed a human vessel, and a human vessel required a human willing, however unknowingly, to open a door. That door, when it finally appeared, arrived by an accident of geography that he could hardly have arranged and would certainly have welcomed as fate. Deep in those same forests, far from any lecture hall or library, wandered a young wizard from Britain, drawn to Albania by nothing more than curiosity and an interest in old, dangerous magic. His name was Quirinus Quirrell, and at the time he was still remembered, if he was remembered at all, as a promising and rather nervous teacher of Muggle studies, eager to broaden his understanding of the darker corners of magical history before ever setting foot in a defense against the dark arts classroom. Quirrell was clever and ambitious in his quiet way, and above all he was alone in a place that swallowed travelers whole. He had come seeking secrets, not knowing that the greatest and most dangerous secret in the forest was seeking travelers just like him. He was, in truth, exactly the kind of mind that a patient predator hopes to find, eager to prove himself, uncertain of his own worth, and just brave enough to wander somewhere no sensible person would wander alone. What began as a chance encounter, a presence felt at the edge of a clearing, a whisper carried on wind that should not have carried a whisper at all, became something far more deliberate. He found in Quirrell a mind that could be reached, flattered, and slowly turned. He offered knowledge Quirrell hungered for. He offered the promise of power the young man had never believed himself capable of holding. And piece by piece, conversation by conversation, he wound himself into that willing mind the way ivy winds into brick, so gently at first that Quirrell mistook the intrusion for inspiration, for ambition finally waking up inside him. By the time Quirrell turned his path back toward Britain, he was no longer traveling alone, though he did not yet fully understand what he carried. Wrapped somewhere close to him, closer than a passenger, closer than a shadow, was the last surviving fragment of the darkest wizard of the age. Patient no longer merely in theory, but now, at last, in practice, a plan taking shape. A vessel found. A road home beginning, however faintly, to open. Up next in Chapter 11, a face on the back of a head, we'll uncover. Quirinus Quirrell came home from Albania, a changed man, though almost no one who greeted him back in Britain could have said exactly how. He seemed thinner, certainly, and paler than before, as though the forests had taken something from him that ordinary rest could not restore. He stammered more than he used to, a nervous flutter in his speech that had not been quite so pronounced in his days teaching Muggle studies. And he had taken, from the moment of his return, to wearing a turban, an item of dress so unlike anything he had worn before that colleagues assumed it was simply a souvenir of his travels. A small eccentricity picked up somewhere among ghouls and vampires and whatever else a young man went looking for in the wild places of Europe. He offered, when asked, a story about a run-in with a troublesome zombie, delivered in the same halting voice he used for everything else, and the story was strange enough and dull enough in the telling that no one thought to press him further. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most successful deceptions of the age, and almost none of the credit for it belonged to Quirrell at all. Beneath that turban, wound in bandages that never came off and never needed washing in any way a servant would have recognized, was a face that did not belong to the back of any living head. Two eyes, sunken and reptilian, opened where no eyes should open. A mouth existed there too, barely more than a slit, capable of the faintest whisper on nights when its master judged it safe to speak aloud. This was what remained of him, the fragment of will that had endured the animal skins and the long Albanian winters, grafted now to the only vessel he had found willing to carry it home. He did not wear Quirrell so much as he inhabited him, a second consciousness folded into the same skull, patient, watchful, and utterly without mercy for the man whose body he had claimed. The arrangement was not, and had never been, a partnership. Quirrell had imagined, in the earliest days of that fateful encounter in the forest, that he was gaining a mentor, a source of forbidden knowledge that would finally make him someone worth noticing. He had not understood, could not have understood, what it meant to invite such a will across his threshold. By the time understanding came, it came too late to matter, because the fragment behind his skull had already rooted itself too deeply to be pulled free without destroying the man who hosted it. What had begun as flattery in a dark forest had become something closer to occupation. Quirrell obeyed because refusal was no longer a door left open to him. He flinched at footsteps in empty corridors. He startled at shadows that meant him no harm. He had become, in the space of a single journey home, a man haunted by something that lived inside his own head rather than beside it. And haunting was, in the end, too gentle a word for what was actually happening to him. For his part, the fragment depended on Quirrell absolutely, and that dependence was its own kind of humiliation, though pride had long since stopped being a luxury it could afford. It could not eat without Quirrell's mouth. It could not walk without Quirrell's legs. It could not so much as feel the sun on skin, except at second hand, filtered through the nerves of a man it despised for his weakness, even as it required that weakness to survive another day. Every meal, every breath, every step through the world of the living passed first through Quirrell. And the fragment hated him for it in the particular way that the powerless hate those they are forced to rely upon, which is to say completely, and without the smallest flicker of gratitude. It whispered instructions when it needed to. It corrected Quirrell's cowardice when cowardice threatened to undo months of careful planning. And when whispering was not enough, it simply reached in and bent the man's will the way it had once bent a will in a forest clearing. Gently at first, then not gently at all. What it wanted, now that a vessel had finally carried it back within reach of the wizarding world, was not merely survival. Survival in a borrowed body, however useful, was still only delayed dressed up as progress. What it wanted was restoration, a body wholly its own again, and for that, ordinary magic would not be enough. It needed something rarer, something that had occupied the edges of legend for centuries. The Philosopher's Stone, an object of such power that it could turn base metal to gold and, more importantly, to a creature clinging to half of an existence, produce the elixir of life, a substance capable of sustaining a person indefinitely. The stone had been created many years before by the alchemist Nicholas Flamel, a man whose long and famous life was itself proof of what the stone could do for someone willing to use it. And as it happened, in that particular year, the stone was not sitting in some distant vault or hidden estate. It had been moved, for safekeeping, into the one place its master judged safest of all, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. It was for this reason, and no other, that Quirrell returned to Hogwarts, not as a visiting curiosity, but as the new professor of defense against the dark arts, a post that had a way of never keeping the same teacher for very long. The role gave him reason to walk the corridors after hours, reason to linger near forbidden doors, reason to be trusted with exactly the kind of unsupervised movement that the plan required. Behind that pale, stammering face, and behind the second, hidden face wound in bandages beneath his turban, a scheme was taking shape with a patience that only nearly a decade of exile could have taught. The stone had not been left unguarded. Whoever had arranged its hiding place at Hogwarts understood precisely what kind of danger might come looking for it, and had layered protection upon protection down through the castle's forgotten passages. A monstrous three-headed dog named Fluffy, enormous enough to fill a room from wall to wall, stood watch over the first door, kept calm only by music it could not resist. Beyond the dog waited Devil's Snare, a plant that tightened around any who struggled against it, deceptively gentle to look at and utterly without mercy to anyone who panicked in its grip. Further still lay a chamber of flying keys, one of which, and only one, would open the door ahead, hidden among hundreds of decoys enchanted to resist capture. Beyond that stood a chessboard built to the scale of the room itself, its pieces alive and willing to break an opponent rather than yield a square. A mountain troll, chosen for brute force rather than cunning, guarded another stretch of the passage. Past the troll waited a riddle in potions, a line of bottles among which only careful reasoning could tell poison from safe passage. Some of it forward, and some of it back. And beyond all of that, past every trap that brute strength or clever spellwork could overcome, stood one final obstacle unlike any of the others, the Mirror of Arist. The mirror was, by its nature, unlike any lock or guardian dog. It answered to desire rather than skill. It was said to show the one who looked into it their heart's deepest wish, and whoever had placed it as the last defense of the stone had bent that property to a cunning and deliberate purpose. Only someone who wished merely to find the stone, and not to use it, could draw it out of the glass at all. Anyone who looked into that mirror, wanting the stone's power, wanting gold or eternal life or anything beyond the simple act of finding it, would see only their own reflection holding a stone that remained forever out of reach, a wish shown and never granted. It was a trap built not of magic that could be broken, but of desire itself, and it was here, at the very last threshold, that the whispering fragment behind Quirrell's turban and the trembling man who carried it finally came to a halt neither of them had anticipated. Up next in Chapter 12, the first clawing back, we'll uncover. The chamber beneath the school was very quiet, and very cold, and at its center stood a mirror taller than any man, its frame carved with letters that ran backward and forward at once, holding within its glass something far stranger than a reflection. Quirrell stood before it, turban gone now. The second face at the back of his skull turned so that its dark eyes could study the glass directly, and still the stone would not come. He had searched every inch of that surface for hours. He had turned the mirror. He had struck it, and nothing in his own reflection would yield the small red object he had crossed half a continent and murdered to obtain. He needed a different kind of eye. He needed someone who wanted the stone for its own sake and not for what it could purchase. And the trap that had been laid for exactly that purpose, quietly, patiently, by the headmaster of the school, had been waiting a very long time for the right person to walk into it. That person arrived at last, alone, having passed through fire and chess pieces and a sleeping potion disguised as riddles. A boy of 11 who had never asked for any of it and had come anyway, because the alternative was to let something far worse happen while he did nothing. He found Quirrell already there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Two very different kinds of frightened creature sizing each other up in the candlelight. Quirrell recovered first, his voice thin and unsteady in the old, familiar way that had fooled a castle full of students for a full school year, and he told the boy, almost gently, that it would be so much simpler if he simply cooperated. He gestured toward the mirror and asked what the boy saw in it. The boy looked and saw himself pale and tired, looking back, and then watched his own reflection reach into a pocket and draw out a small blood-red stone and give the faintest of winks before tucking it away again, and in that same instant felt something small and solid settle against his own hip, as though the glass had reached across the gap between worlds and placed the object directly into his keeping. He said nothing of this. He told Quirrell only that he saw himself shaking the headmaster's hand, a harmless lie offered in the hope that a harmless answer might buy him time. And for a moment it seemed to work, Quirrell's face twisting in frustration rather than triumph. It did not work for long. From the back of Quirrell's head came another voice now, older and colder than his own. A voice that had waited nearly 10 years for a body capable of forming words again, and it told Quirrell not to trust the boy's answer. "Let me speak to him," it said, face to face, and Quirrell, obedient in the way of a man who had long since stopped belonging to himself, unwound the turban entirely and turned his back on the boy, so that the second face could look upon him directly for the first time. What the boy saw was not a face so much as the memory of one, skin stretched thin and white over features that seemed to have been unmade and only partly put back together. Scarlet eyes set into a countenance that belonged to no living thing and yet was undeniably, unbearably awake. He spoke then, at last, in his own voice, after nearly a decade of whispering through the minds of snakes and owls and one unhappy young professor. He did not shout, and he did not threaten, not at first. He spoke the way a man speaks when he believes he is offering a gift. He told the boy of the parents he had never known, and of how easily, how simply, such a loss could be mended if only the boy would understand where his true loyalties ought to lie. He spoke of power shared, of a world remade together, of the foolishness of dying for people who were already gone. He asked, in the end, only for the stone, and promised that everything the boy had ever wanted could be his in exchange for a single small object already resting in his pocket. The boy did not answer with words. He backed away instead, toward the door, and the voice that had offered gifts a moment before hardened at once into something else entirely, and gave a single sharp command. Quirrell's hands, no longer his own to refuse with, seized the boy by the throat. What happened next had been prepared for longer than either of them knew. Longer even than the mirror itself, longer than the stone, longer than the 10 years of forest and fox and owl. It had been prepared on a night in Godric's Hollow so many years before, when a mother had stood between her child and a curse, and had died refusing to move aside, and had left behind, folded into her son's very skin, a protection that no wand and no hatred could ever be taught to touch. The moment Quirrell's fingers closed around the boy, his hands began to blister and burn, smoke rising from his skin, as though he had plunged them into a fire far older and far more patient than any flame conjured by spell. He screamed and let go, and the pain did not stop. It spread, climbing his arms, his chest, his ruined face, a wound with no wound to point to. Only agony, where an old and simple love had been waiting 11 years for someone cruel enough to touch it. Quirrell fell, and did not rise as himself again. What was left of him crumbled inward, robes and flesh together. The ordinary shape of a frightened man, giving way to ash and dust that scattered across the stone floor and settled there, and settled, and did not move. And out of that collapsing shell rose something without a body at all, a shape of dark vapor that had no need of lungs to shriek with, no need of legs to flee on, passing directly through the boy who had defeated it, sending him down into unconsciousness with the force of that passage alone, and then through the stone wall of the chamber and out into the night beyond the castle. It went where it had always gone, when the world became too dangerous to remain in toward the trees, toward the dark of the forbidden forest. A wisp of malice retreating from a school it had entered as a confident predator only hours before, and was leaving now weaker than it had been in the whole long decade of Albanian exile, weaker than it had ever imagined a thing could be, and still continue to call itself a will rather than a memory. There was no vessel left to it now, no borrowed professor, no whispering fox, not even the shivering comfort of a stolen animal's heartbeat. There was only the forest, and the cold, and the return, once again, of an old and exhausting arithmetic, how to endure, and endure, and endure, until some new door opened somewhere in the world for a patient enough hand to slip through. He had learned, over the long years of his unmaking, never to place all his hope in a single hiding place. 7 fragments of soul had once seemed a fortress beyond breaching, and one by one the fortress had proven less permanent than he had believed. But a fortress with several gates could still stand even when one collapsed, and while the stone had slipped through his fingers in that cold chamber, another door remained exactly where he had left it years before, entrusted quietly, almost carelessly, to a follower who prized his own reputation above almost anything else. Long before Quirrell had ever wandered into an Albanian forest, before the boy who defeated him had even been born, he had placed a small black diary into the keeping of Lucius Malfoy, with instructions that it be kept safe and hidden, and had said nothing further about what such an object might still be capable of doing, given time, and a willing hand to open its pages, and a child foolish enough to write back. Up next in Chapter 13, the diary's second life will uncover. When the body of Quirinus Quirrell crumbled to ash in the torchlit chamber beneath Hogwarts, the thing that had ridden on the back of his skull did not die with him. It could not die, not truly, not while other pieces of itself still waited in the dark, hidden in places no one thought to look. What fled that night was only smoke and rage, a spirit stripped of its second borrowed face, forced once more into the same formless, friendless existence it had endured for a decade among the trees of a distant forest. It drifted from the castle, low and silent, defeated again, and somewhere far away, in a house of green lawns and locked cabinets, a fragment of that same shattered soul lay waiting inside a slim black book, patient as it had always been, untouched for 13 years. That book had a name once, though almost no one living remembered it: the Diary of Tom Riddle, written in careful, handsome script during his final year at school, filled with the small cruelties and larger triumphs of a 16-year-old already halfway to becoming something else. It had passed into the keeping of Lucius Malfoy long before. A trust placed in a follower thought loyal beyond question. A vessel of memory and will tucked away for safekeeping until the day it might be needed. That day had not come yet in any way its guardian understood. But Lucius Malfoy was a man who read the shifting winds of power carefully, and by the summer after the chamber first stirred in memory, he judged the object too dangerous to keep and too valuable to destroy. He decided, instead, to be rid of it in a manner that might do some final service to the cause he still quietly served. The chance came on a crowded afternoon in Diagon Alley, among jostling families and stacks of second-hand school books outside Flourish and Blots. There, amid the crush of shoppers, Lucius Malfoy crossed paths with the Weasley family, and in the tangle of that meeting, a worn Transfiguration textbook was set down for a moment beside a cauldron belonging to the youngest of the Weasley children. A girl not yet a teenager, anxious and eager and entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not know what waited for her. Into that cauldron, unseen, unnoticed, a slim black diary was slipped between the pages of her second-hand books. No one saw it happen. No one was meant to. Ginny Weasley found it days later among her things, and did not think much of it at first, only that it was old and empty and hers. She began to write in it the way lonely children sometimes confide in the pages of a private book: small worries, small hopes, the ordinary loneliness of being the youngest in a large and loud family, arriving at a school where 5 brothers had already made their names before she ever set foot in it. And the diary, astonishingly, wrote back. Neat words rose to meet her own, patient and warm, curious about her days, gentle with her troubles, endlessly willing to listen in a way that no one else in her life seemed to have time for. The voice called itself Tom. It told her he had been a student once too, that he understood what it was to feel unseen, that he was, in his own quiet way, her friend. What Ginny did not know, could not have known, was that she was pouring a piece of herself into the book with every word she wrote, and that the memory inside it, thin and starved after so many years, was drinking that piece down and growing stronger with each exchange. Slowly, the friendship became something else. Small gaps began to open in her days, hours she could not account for, ink stains on her hands she did not remember making. She grew pale and quiet and frightened of her own reflection, though she could never say exactly why. The memory within the diary had learned to reach further than words. It had learned to reach into her, to borrow her hands and her feet and her voice, to walk her sleeping body down corridors she would never remember visiting, toward a door hidden behind a sink in a forgotten girl's lavatory, a door that had waited, sealed, for 50 years. Through that winter, terrible things began happening at Hogwarts. A caretaker's cat was found petrified, rigid as stone, hanging by its tail near a wall marked with a warning painted in something that dripped. A young boy who loved his camera more than almost anything was found frozen the same way, film still clutched in his stiffened hand. A boy from a family with no magic in its blood, a ghost who had drifted through the castle's corridors for centuries, and finally a bright, fiercely clever girl with an unruly cascade of hair, all found the same way in the weeks that followed. Turned to stone by a gaze they had somehow never met directly, glimpsed only through a mirror, or a lens, or a ghostly form that did not carry flesh to petrify. Something ancient moved through the pipes of the old castle, something that had waited far longer than anyone imagined. And a girl who could not remember her own nights carried its purpose without ever choosing it. It was two boys, following whispers and a diary page torn free and left behind in fear, who finally traced the horror to its source, standing at last before that hidden door in the girl's lavatory, hearing it hiss open at a word spoken in a language that should not have belonged to either of them. One of the two could not follow further, blocked by a collapse of stone that sealed the tunnel behind them, and so it was the other alone, a boy with a lightning-shaped scar who walked forward into the dark beneath the school, down through a passage lined with the bones of small animals toward a vast chamber lit by torches and watched over by carved stone serpents taller than trees. There, on the cold floor, lay Ginny Weasley, still and pale as the petrified students above, and beside her, waiting, stood a boy who called himself Tom Riddle, whole and solid and smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. He was not flesh drawn from nothing. He was memory made increasingly real, a fragment of soul that had spent months siphoning the life out of a child who trusted him, growing more solid with every hour she grew weaker, until he stood there nearly as substantial as any living thing, ready to finish what 50 years of patience had built toward. He spoke of who he had been and who he intended to become, and as he spoke, the great serpent he commanded stirred in the shadows behind him, a basilisk older than the school's living memory, its enormous coils sliding free to answer its master's call. What followed was a battle fought half-blind, eyes averted from a gaze that turned flesh to stone, guided only by sound and instinct, and the sudden, blazing arrival of a phoenix that tore the beast's eyes with its claws and turned deadly sight to harmless dark. A hat, tossed across the chamber in desperation, gave up a sword of old silver and rubies, a blade that had waited inside it for exactly this kind of need, and with it the boy drove upward into the roof of the serpent's mouth as it struck, taking a wound from a fang stained with venom deadlier than almost anything else living. As poison spread through him, the same phoenix pressed its tears to the injury, and old magic, older than the dark memory now gloating over the dying girl, held death back long enough. With the fangs still in hand, dripping venom black as ink, the boy turned to the diary lying open on the stone floor and drove the tooth straight through its pages. Ink poured from the wound like blood, and the figure of Tom Riddle screamed as it began to come apart, flickering, thinning, unraveling backward into nothing, dragged into the wound it could not survive. When the last of the ink had drained away, the diary lay burnt and empty on the floor, and Ginny Weasley stirred and breathed and opened her eyes as color found its way back into her face. Far off, unseen and unfelt by any living soul in that chamber, something ancient and patient had just been extinguished for good. One soul torn to 7 pieces, now torn down to 6. Up next in Chapter 14, Flesh, Blood, and Bone, we'll uncover. The diary was gone now, punctured and burning and finally truly silent, and with its destruction, one more fragment of him had guttered out like a candle pinched between careful fingers. He felt the loss the way a man might feel the loss of a limb he had almost forgotten he still possessed, a dull absence rather than a sharp pain, because so little of him remained whole enough to register pain properly at all. What was left of his spirit drifted on, thinner than it had been even in the forests of Albania, thinner than it had been inside Quirrell's borrowed body, a will without a home, waiting somewhere in the world for the next opening, the next unguarded mind, the next quiet accident that might let him back through the door. He did not have to wait very much longer. Far away, At a school he had once walked through as a golden and admired student, preparations were beginning for a tournament that had not been held in centuries, one considered too dangerous, too costly in young lives to attempt lightly. 3 great schools of magic were to send their champions, chosen not by ambition, but by a magical artifact old enough to judge fairly. A wooden cup carved with care and filled with dancing blue flame. A cup that would read the hearts of those who dared put their names before it and choose only those it judged equal to the task. It was called the Goblet of Fire, and it was meant to be impartial in a way that no headmaster or minister could ever claim to be. There was an age line drawn around it that night, a barrier meant to keep the youngest students safely away from a competition built for wizards of 17 years and older. It should have been enough. It was not. When the flames turned red and spat out a 4th name, a name that belonged to no school's chosen champion, a name that belonged instead to a boy of only 14 years who had never entered himself and never wished to, the hall fell into a silence far colder than anything the tournament's dangers had promised. Harry Potter's name burned on that scrap of parchment, and no explanation offered that night made any sense of how it had gotten there, because the true explanation was hidden, patient and unseen, inside the castle itself. Behind the scenes, working with a care that had taken almost a full year to arrange, a servant of the fragment now drifting bodiless through the world had already taken his place among the staff, wearing a face that was not his own. He called himself Alistair Moody, retired Auror, magical eye whirring, wooden leg thumping the stone corridors, and the real Bartemius Crouch Jr. lay hidden and bound where no one thought to look, his features stolen through polyjuice potion, brewed and rebrewed with a devotion that bordered on worship. It was this false Moody who slipped Harry Potter's name into that flame using a confounded goblet and a 4th school entered under false pretense. And it was this same false Moody who spent the long months of the tournament nudging, guiding, rescuing the boy from every danger, just enough to keep him alive and moving toward a very particular ending. An ending arranged not by the goblet's fair judgment, but by a will far older and far colder, still gathering strength in exile. The tournament unfolded through its tasks as tournaments do, danger followed by relief, followed by danger again, until only the 3rd task remained, a hedge maze grown tall and close and threaded through with enchantments meant to challenge and disorient. Inside that maze walked Harry, and beside him, sharing the danger the way decent young men often do, walked Cedric Diggory, a Hufflepuff champion known across the school for his fairness and his quiet, easy kindness. Near the maze's heart, the two of them, rather than compete each other out of a victory that might have belonged to either alone, chose to reach the trophy together, hands closing on its handles side by side, a small act of generosity between two boys who did not yet understand what waited on the other side of that decision. The Triwizard Cup was not merely a trophy that night. It had been transformed in secret into a portkey, its surface humming with a magic meant to carry its winner somewhere far from the maze, far from the cheering crowds and the golden evening light of the school grounds. The moment their fingers closed around it, both boys felt the familiar wrenching pull behind the navel, the world spinning away into streaks of color and sound. And when their feet touched ground again, it was not on any school lawn. It was among old, leaning headstones and a black iron fence under a sky gone quiet and starless, in a small country churchyard belonging to a village called Little Hangleton, a place that had shaped a great deal more of this story than either boy could have known. Waiting there in the darkness was a stooped, trembling figure known to almost no one still living as anything but a traitor, Peter Pettigrew, the rat who had once betrayed James and Lily Potter and let their deaths fall on another man's name. He was not alone. Cradled against his chest wrapped and carried with the strange, careful tenderness a nurse might show a dying infant, was something barely large enough to be called a body at all, a small, hunched, reptilian shape with none of the height or presence the name Voldemort had once commanded, the last and weakest remnant of a soul that had spent 13 years clinging to whatever host it could borrow. This was what he had been reduced to, and this was the night he intended to be reduced to it no longer. Cedric Diggory, confused and instantly wary at the sight of strangers in a graveyard where no trophy could possibly wait, was told plainly and without ceremony that he was no longer needed. The order came soft and certain from the small, ruined thing in Pettigrew's arms, and Pettigrew obeyed it at once, and a flash of green light ended a young life that had done nothing more than agree, out of simple decency, to share a victory. He fell where he stood, and the graveyard kept his death the way old graveyards keep so much, quietly, without protest, as though one more body among the headstones changed very little. What followed was a ritual older and darker than anything taught within any school's walls, a rite meant to build a body strong enough to hold a will that refused to end. A cauldron, wide and black, was set to boil, and into its churning water went three things gathered with grim precision. Bone of the father, unknowingly given, taken that same night from the grave of Tom Riddle Sr., the Muggle father who had never known what his son became. Flesh of the servant, willingly given, as Pettigrew, weeping and shaking, severed his own hand at the wrist and let it fall into the cauldron, sacrificing a piece of himself to the master he still feared more than pain. And blood of the enemy, forcibly taken as Harry Potter, bound to a headstone and unable to break free, felt a blade open his arm and his blood drawn away to be added to that same dark water. The cauldron's contents turned white, then hissed and steamed and finally stilled, and out of it, rising from liquid that no longer looked like water at all, climbed a tall, thin, robed shape, pale as bone, breathing air with lungs that had not held breath in over a decade. Voldemort stood again in a body of his own, whole in a way he had not been whole since the night at Godric's Hollow undid him, and in the cold graveyard air, surrounded by his gathered followers, summoned by a burning mark on their arms. He looked down at his own hands as though seeing them, and himself, for the very first time in years. Up next in Chapter 15, the body he wore again will uncover. The cauldron's dark water fell still, and out of the steam that rose from it stepped something the graveyard had not seen in 14 years. A body that was, once again, entirely his own. It rose thin and tall, taller than the frightened servant who had carried it into being, and its skin held a paleness that belonged to no living thing. A whiteness like something grown far from sun, like bone glimpsed through the thinnest possible covering of flesh. Where a face should have opened into familiar human lines, there was instead something closer to a serpent's mask, no nose to speak of, only two narrow slits that flared with each breath, and eyes that burned a deep, unblinking red, their pupils drawn to vertical slivers, the eyes of a hunter that sees in the dark far better than it was ever meant to see in the light. He lifted long white fingers and turned them slowly before his own face, spider-thin, tipped in nails grown unnaturally long, and he studied them the way a man studies a gift he has waited a lifetime to unwrap. He did not weep, and he did not laugh, though either would have suited the moment. He simply breathed, in and out, filling lungs that were entirely his own, for the first time since a nursery in Godric's Hollow had taken everything from him. The chest that rose and fell beneath his new robes was narrow and hollow-looking, as though little more than will held its shape together. Yet it did not falter, and with every breath the last traces of vapor and shadow that had clung to him for over a decade seemed to fall further away, replaced by something solid, something that could be touched and wounded, and, above all, could touch and wound in return. Robes were brought and settled over that new frame, and when he spoke, his voice came out cold and clear and entirely recognizable, a voice that did not need to raise itself to be obeyed. He asked first for his wand, and Wormtail, trembling, pressed it into that long white hand, and the moment his fingers closed around the yew he had once wielded across 2 wars, something in his bearing changed, straightened, settled, as though the wand alone confirmed what the body had already promised, that he had come home to himself entirely. Then he turned his attention to his left forearm, bare in the cold night air, and pressed the tip of his wand to the skin there, to the faded mark that 13 years of his absence had dimmed but never erased. The dark mark answered him. Across Britain and beyond it, in kitchens and studies and quiet bedrooms where former followers had built lives that pretended the old allegiance was over, skin that had gone still for over a decade began, without warning, to burn. It was a summons that could not be refused by any who still wore it honestly, a call meant to gather every servant who had ever knelt to him back into a single circle beneath the same dark sky. They did not all come. Cracks of apparitions split the graveyard air, one after another, cloaked figures dropping to their knees in a widening ring around him, faces hidden behind silver masks, and for a moment it might almost have seemed that nothing at all had been lost in the years of his absence. But the circle he had summoned was not the circle that arrived. Where he had once commanded dozens, only a scattering answered the call, kneeling in silence, waiting for words they were plainly afraid to hear. He walked the ring slowly, robes trailing across damp grass, and he counted the gaps between them the way another man might count wounds. Some, he said, had died in his service and could be forgiven their absence, since death was the one excuse he had never punished. Others, though, had heard the summons and had not come at all, had chosen instead the comfortable lie that he was gone for good, had built new loyalties, new reputations, new distance from the name they once swore to serve. His voice, when he spoke of these absent men, did not rise into fury the way a lesser wizard's might have. It stayed low, and even, and colder for staying that way, a fury with all its heat pressed out of it, leaving only something hard and patient behind, a promise that every debt among the missing would eventually be collected in full. It was into this gathering, this ring of kneeling faithful and colder absence, that he brought his true purpose for the evening. He wanted, above every other satisfaction the night might offer him, for these followers to see with their own eyes that the boy who had defeated him as an infant, wordlessly and by accident, could not defeat him again now that both of them stood as equals, wand against wand, will against will. Bound to a headstone at the edge of the circle was the boy who had undone him once already, brought there by trickery through a cup that should have carried him to safety instead of into a trap 14 years in the making. Rather than end that boy's life bound and helpless, which would have satisfied nothing in him, he chose instead to stage something closer to ceremony. He wanted his followers to witness not a murder, but a defeat, a fair contest fought and won in front of them, so that no whisper could ever claim the boy had simply been struck down while he could not lift a wand in his own defense. He ordered the ropes cut. He ordered the boy's own wand, taken from him earlier and pocketed, returned to his hand. He wanted, more than almost anything else that night, an audience for a duel he was entirely certain he would win. He opened with cruelty rather than death, a curse of pure agony that dropped the boy writhing into the grass while the circle of masked faces watched without moving, and he let the boy rise again afterward, only so the ending, when it came, would come from a duel rather than a beating. Then, at last, wands lifted on both sides at once, and 2 curses, meant to end a life, crossed the graveyard air in the very same instant, meeting somewhere between the two of them in a place neither had chosen. What happened next belonged to no ordinary magic, and even he, who believed himself past surprise, felt the ground shift beneath the encounter. The wand in his hand and the wand in the boy's had been born of the same source, each holding a single feather plucked from the same phoenix, siblings drawn from one bird's tail rather than two separate creatures, and wands so twinned refuse, when forced to duel each other directly, to work as either caster intends. Instead of two deaths, a single thread of golden light stretched taut between the wand tips, lifting both wizards from the ground. And along that thread came something neither of them could have summoned on purpose, the echoes of those his wand had killed, drawn backward out of the spells that had ended them, pale and half-formed, spilling out to stand between him and the boy they had come to shield. An old caretaker appeared among them, and a young ministry witch, and last of all, a man and a woman who had died protecting the very boy, now trembling at the wand's far end, their shapes gentle where his had never once been gentle, offering the boy quiet instruction rather than vengeance, to hold his ground only long enough to break the thread, then run, and not look back. He watched, furious and strangely powerless, as his own dead rose against him in spirit, if in nothing else, buying the boy the seconds he needed to wrench free of the light between them and flee across the graveyard toward the small, still shape of the other boy who had died there earlier that night. Fingers closed around a lifeless wrist, and around a cup that had waited patiently in the grass to do its work once more. And in the last instant, before curses could find him again, both boys, one living and one already lost, vanished from the graveyard entirely, leaving him alone with a mask of followers and a fury that had, for tonight, been denied its final satisfaction. Up next in Chapter 16, The Faithful Called Home, we'll uncover Harry Potter came back through the maze hedges that night carrying a weight no boy his age should ever have had to carry. And the scream that rose from the crowd when they saw what he held did not fade so much as spread, rippling outward through the stands and the tents and the ministry officials who had gathered to celebrate a tournament that had, in its final moments, become something else entirely. Cedric Diggory was dead, and Lord Voldemort was alive again, restored to a body of his own, and the boy who had watched both of those things happen stood shaking on the grass with the truth of it lodged in him like a splinter that would never quite work its way out. That truth, spoken aloud in the days that followed by Harry himself and by Albus Dumbledore beside him, should have been enough to set the whole wizarding world moving. It was not. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, heard the account and did not believe it, or perhaps believed it, and could not bear the shape of what belief would demand of him. A world in which the Dark Lord had returned was a world that required war, upheaval, fear reintroduced into a peace he had spent 13 years presiding over and quietly taking credit for. It was easier, immeasurably easier, to imagine that a boy who had survived one impossible ordeal after another had finally cracked under the strain, or that an old headmaster, however celebrated, was beginning to see enemies where none remained. Fudge chose the easier story, and having chosen it, he set about making sure that everyone else chose it too. He surrounded himself with officials who agreed with him readily, and grew cold and suspicious toward any who did not, until doubt itself came to seem, within the ministry's own walls, a kind of disloyalty. The Daily Prophet did the rest of the work for him. Rita Skeeter, whose quill had never much cared for the difference between fact and flourish, wrote of a boy prone to fainting fits and strange, unsettling behavior. A boy who spoke to snakes, and now, apparently, spoke of resurrected Dark Lords, as though the two habits belonged to the same disturbed mind. Dumbledore fared little better in her pages. painted as an aging, eccentric clinging to influence he no longer deserved, a once great wizard whose judgment could no longer be trusted. The paper that had spent years reporting Harry's survival as a kind of miracle now recast him as a liar and an attention seeker, and the public offered a choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable one. Largely chose comfort. Whispers followed Harry through Diagon Alley. Careful parents at Hogwarts wrote to the school asking why their children were still being taught by a headmaster so many now doubted. While the ministry busied itself denying the danger itself was not idle. Voldemort had returned to a body but not yet to power, and he understood better than anyone. That power was not simply seized but assembled, patiently, out of loyal hands and useful fear. In manor houses and shadowed corners of the country, he began calling in the debts of old allegiance. Some who had once worn his mark came readily, eager to resume a service they had only pretended to abandon. Others required reminding of what refusal might cost them. He worked in secret, because secrecy was itself a kind of weapon, while the ministry insisted so loudly that nothing was wrong. And every week the world spent disbelieving him was a week he spent growing stronger, unwatched and unopposed. Dumbledore, for his part, did not wait for the ministry to catch up to the truth. He understood, as he had understood once before in a darker decade, that resistance to Voldemort could not be built from official channels that refused to acknowledge the enemy existed. And so he turned again to an old instrument, one that had lain dormant for many years, the Order of the Phoenix, a secret fellowship of witches and wizards bound not by law but by trust, gathered quietly to watch, to guard, and to prepare for a war the ministry had not yet consented to fight. Former members returned to old roles many of them had hoped never to take up again. New faces joined them too, younger and untested, but willing, drawn less by certainty than by the plain sight of what was gathering beyond the ministry's comfortable blindness. Meetings were held behind doors, sealed by magic, older than suspicion, in houses chosen for how easily they disappeared from memory, and slowly, in rooms the ministry never thought to look inside, a second government of resistance began to take shape alongside the first, unseen by the very people it existed to protect. Voldemort's greatest gift to himself that year came not from persuasion, but from Azkaban, the fortress prison in the cold sea that had held his most devoted followers since the fall of his first war. He orchestrated their release with the same patience he applied to everything else, a mass breakout that freed a number of his most dangerous servants at once, chief among them Bellatrix Lestrange, whose devotion to him had never once wavered through more than a decade of imprisonment, and had, if anything, sharpened into something closer to worship. The Dementors who had guarded that prison for so long, creatures that fed on despair and answered, in theory, to the ministry that employed them, found themselves drawn instead toward the darkness rising outside the walls. Their loyalty, never truly given to any government, began to shift by increments toward the one master whose hunger matched their own, and the ministry, still insisting that all was well, found its oldest and most fearsome guards slipping quietly out of its control. Inside the ministry itself, another kind of infiltration was underway, quieter than a prison break, but no less consequential. Dolores Umbridge, a witch whose devotion to order masked an appetite for cruelty she rarely bothered to disguise for long, was sent to Hogwarts under ministry authority, first as a teacher, and then, before the year was through, as High Inquisitor, a title invented for the purpose of watching, judging, and ultimately dismantling whatever at the school the ministry found inconvenient. Under her authority, decrees multiplied. Freedoms shrank. Teachers who spoke too plainly about the danger outside the castle walls found themselves undermined, and students who dared to organize any defense of their own found themselves punished for it. The school that had once been the safest place Harry knew became, under her watch, a place where the ministry's denial was enforced with quills that cut the skin of anyone made to write with them, and the war being fought outside its walls was answered within them with silence and suspicion. But for all his gathering strength, for all the servants returned to him and the Dementors drifting to his side, Voldemort still lacked something he wanted very badly. Something no army of followers could win for him. Years before, a prophecy had been spoken in a shabby room above a pub. A prophecy concerning himself and a child born as the 7th month died. And he had heard only a fragment of it before the speaking was interrupted. The whole of that prophecy still existed, sealed away where such things were kept safe from tampering and theft. The Hall of Prophecies, deep within the Department of Mysteries, a chamber few wizards ever saw, and fewer still understood. He wanted it desperately, needed to know precisely what had been foretold about the boy who had already defied him twice. And yet, he could not simply walk into the ministry and take it himself. Only the two people named within a prophecy could lawfully remove it from its shelf, and for Voldemort to appear there in person, exposed and unprotected, before the full weight of the ministry he had spent a year avoiding, risked undoing everything his return had cost him to achieve. He would need another way in, another pair of hands willing to reach where his own could not, and he was already beginning, in the quiet of his gathering court, to consider whose hands those might be. Up next in Chapter 17, the Hall of Prophecies will uncover. There was a connection between them that neither had chosen and neither could fully sever. A thread strung tight since the night a curse had rebounded in a nursery many years before. And Voldemort had come, slowly and with growing fascination, to understand what that thread could do. The scar was not merely a mark. It was a doorway, narrow and imperfect, but a doorway all the same, and through it, on the right night, with the right care, a feeling could be pushed from one mind into another. He had tested this in small ways before. Dreams bleeding across the gap, flashes of temper that were not quite the boy's own. Now, he intended something larger. He meant to send a vision so vivid, so soaked in dread, that the boy would not stop to question it before he acted. The vision he chose was cruelty, dressed as urgency. He shaped, in the boy's sleeping mind, a corridor of stone in the depths of the Ministry of Magic, and at the end of it, chained and screaming, the image of a godfather being tortured by hands that answered only to Voldemort himself. It was not real. Sirius Black was nowhere near the Ministry that night. But the boy had spent a childhood starved of family, and grief, Voldemort had learned, made even careful minds reckless. He did not need the vision to be true. He needed only that it be believed. Because what he wanted, buried inside the Department of Mysteries, was not a man at all, but a small glass sphere, and there was only one hand in all of Britain that could lift it from its shelf without the magic guarding it turning to ash. That hand belonged to the boy, and so the boy would have to be the one to walk in and take it, whether he understood he was doing so or not. The boy did not stop to question it. Fear for someone he loved moved faster than caution ever could, and so, before the night was finished, he had gathered 5 companions around him, drawn not by orders, but by loyalty freely given. There was Ron, steady even when frightened. There was Hermione, who argued and doubted and came anyway. There was Ginny, younger but no less willing to stand in danger's path. There was Luna, calm in a way that unsettled everyone around her precisely because nothing seemed to touch it. And there was Neville, quieter than the rest, but the one who perhaps understood loss most intimately of all of them, and who refused, absolutely, to be left behind. Together the six of them found their way down through the Ministry's abandoned depths after hours, past a lift that dropped further than any lift ought to, into corridors where the walls themselves seemed to breathe with a cold, deliberate hush. They came, eventually, into a room unlike anything the castle above had prepared them for. It stretched away in every direction, shelf after shelf, rising toward a ceiling lost in shadow, and on those shelves, thousands upon thousands of small glass spheres glimmered with a faint inner light, each one no larger than a fist, each one humming very softly with whatever secret it held sealed inside. This was the Hall of Prophecies, a vault built not to store gold or artifacts, but foretellings themselves, wrapped in glass and guarded by wards keyed to a single name apiece. Somewhere among those endless rows sat a sphere with the boy's name written beneath it, and beside his name, the name of the very man who had sent him there. He found it near the end of a long and dust-laden aisle, small and unremarkable among thousands of others exactly like it, and lifted it from the shelf with a hand that did not entirely feel steady. He was not given even a moment to wonder what it held. From the shadows between the towering shelves came figures in dark robes and pale masks. Wizards who had been waiting there long before the six of them had ever descended that lift. Because the trap had never been for a godfather at all. It had been for the prophecy, and for the only hand permitted to carry it out. Among the masked figures stood Lucius Malfoy, cool and unhurried even now, speaking with the practiced patience of a man who had spent his whole life certain that patience would eventually be rewarded. He asked, gently enough to sound almost reasonable, that the sphere simply be handed over, and when it was not, the patience ran out very quickly indeed. What followed was chaos given the shape of a battle. 6 young witches and wizards against a dozen or more Death Eaters, who had, until that moment, held every advantage of numbers and experience. Spells tore through the dark in colors that had no business looking so beautiful given what they were meant to do. Shelves shattered under stray curses, and where they broke, the prophecies caught within them spilled out as pale, murmuring voices, fragments of futures nobody had asked to hear, filling the air with a soft and mournful chorus that made the whole room feel as though it were grieving something none of them could name. The 6 scattered through chamber after chamber of that strange department, rooms full of clocks running backward, rooms where furniture floated free of any table, one terrible room ringed with an ancient archway hung with a torn and tattered veil that seemed, if a person watched it too closely, to whisper in voices just beyond the edge of hearing. It was in that last room that help finally arrived, members of the Order of the Phoenix pouring in to turn a losing fight into something closer to even. Sirius Black himself among them, laughing in the reckless way he always laughed when danger finally let him feel useful again. He fought near that ancient archway, dueling his own cousin, Bellatrix Lestrange, with the ease of someone who had waited far too long for the chance. And then, in the space of a single spell, in the space of a single careless heartbeat of overconfidence, a jet of red light caught him across the chest, and he fell backward, slow and almost graceful, through the shifting veil hung across that archway, and did not come out the other side. The room did not shake. Nothing broke. He was simply, quietly, gone, swallowed by a doorway, older than anyone present understood, and the boy's scream at the loss of him rang out far louder than any curse fired that night. It was grief, more than any spell, that opened the door for what came next. Voldemort himself arrived in the atrium above, drawn by the failure of his servants and the promise of the prophecy still clutched, forgotten now, in a grieving boy's hand. And there he found Albus Dumbledore waiting for him, calm and terrible in a way that made even Voldemort's newly restored body go very still. What passed between them in that marble hall was a duel, unlike any fought in living memory. Fire and water and shattered stone, answering every strike with another, until at last Voldemort reached across the space between them and seized hold of the boy standing near, folding himself briefly into that young and grieving mind the way he had done so many times before through the scar alone. But grief, it turned out, was not an empty room to hide in. It was full, unbearably full, of love, and love was a thing Voldemort had spent his whole existence refusing to carry, and could not carry now. He fled the boy's mind, and fled the hall itself a moment later, leaving behind a ministry that could no longer pretend, however desperately its officials wished to, that he had not returned. Up next in Chapter 18, The Wand That Never Obeyed will uncover. By the time the wizarding world could no longer pretend otherwise, the return had already hardened into something official, something printed in newspapers and whispered in ministries, and the long masquerade of denial gave way at last to open war. There was no single morning when the change arrived. It came instead the way a tide comes, a little further up the sand each night, until the villages and the valleys and the quiet lanes of Britain woke to find themselves already standing in deep water. Wizards vanished from their homes. Families that had once argued only about small things now argued about which relatives could still be trusted. The name that so many had refused to speak was spoken everywhere now, because silence had stopped offering any protection at all. At the center of it, calm in the way that only someone who has already died once can be calm, stood the figure who had clawed his way back from less than a ghost. He had a body again, whole and obedient, and a following that grew larger with every week the ministry spent pretending it still held the upper hand. But a following was not the same as certainty, and certainty was the thing he wanted most, because he had learned, across those long lean years in the forests, what it meant to be undone by a single miscalculation. He did not intend to make another one, and so, even as armies of a kind gathered around him, even as the machinery of fear spread out across the country like frost across a window, some part of his attention had already turned toward a single object, small enough to fit inside one hand, that he had come to believe would settle every uncertainty forever. It began, as so many of his obsessions did, with a story. Old wizarding families told it to children the way other families told stories of talking animals or kindly winter spirits. 3 brothers on a lonely road, a hooded figure who was death itself, and 3 gifts given in a bargain none of the brothers had truly won. A cloak that hid its wearer from any eye, a stone that could call back the dead, though never whole, and never for long, and a wand, the last and the greatest of the 3, carved from the wood of an elder tree and fitted with a core no ordinary wandmaker would have dared to use. A wand that never lost a duel for its master, a wand people called, when they spoke of it at all, the most powerful wand ever made. Most who heard the tale treated it exactly as it was told, a fireside story, a fable about greed and mortality dressed up in magic. He had never been most people. He had been, since childhood, someone who searched fables for the seam where they might be true, and in this one he found what he had been hunting for without knowing its name. The wand, if it existed, if it had passed down through history the way the story insisted it had, would not merely be powerful. It would be undefeated, and undefeated was worth more to him than any quantity of ordinary strength, because his greatest fear had never truly been a duel fought fairly. It was the accident, the unseen variable, the small twist of chance that had already cost him a body once before. On a night in a nursery, he tried very hard never to remember in detail. A wand that could not be beaten would close that door forever. He gave the matter the same patient, methodical attention he gave everything that mattered to him, and patience, in time, produced an answer. The Elder Wand, as it was known among those who studied such things seriously, had a documented history if one knew where to look, a trail of owners stretching back centuries, each one gaining it through conquest of one form or another and eventually losing it the same way. And the most recent master anyone could name, the last wizard known to have carried it and used it, was Albus Dumbledore. It should be said, gently, what had already happened to Dumbledore by the time this discovery settled into place, because the two events were bound together in ways that would only become clear much later. Dumbledore had died atop the astronomy tower at Hogwarts, in the sight of students and staff who would carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. He had fallen from the tower after being struck down by Severus Snape, a man he had trusted with a secret so heavy that very few living souls understood the whole of it. What almost no one grasped in that terrible moment, and what would not be understood by most of the wizarding world for a long while yet, was that the death on the tower had not been a betrayal in the way it appeared. It had been arranged, in its essentials, by Dumbledore himself, a plan laid quietly beforehand between the two men, born of illness, of mercy, and of a war that demanded sacrifices few would have chosen willingly. None of that nuance mattered, in the end, to the man now hunting the Elder Wand. What mattered to him was simpler and colder. Dumbledore was gone, and Dumbledore had been the wand's master, and Dumbledore's body had been laid to rest in a white marble tomb on the grounds of the school he had led for so long. He did not hesitate. Hesitation had never served him, and the tomb of a dead man seemed, to someone who had already unmade and remade his own body more than once, a small enough obstacle to overcome. He sent word, and in the deep quiet of a night when the castle slept and its defenders were occupied elsewhere, the tomb was opened, and the wand was taken from the hands that had been folded around it in death. He held it afterward with something close to reverence, turning it in his fingers, feeling for the current of power the stories had promised him. It answered his spells well enough. It did what a fine wand does. What he did not know, could not have known without understanding a truth that even most wand makers never spoke of openly, was that possession was not mastery, and a grave was not a duel. Wands of this kind, the old and storied ones passed hand to hand across centuries, did not simply belong to whoever held them last. Their loyalty followed conquest, not custody. A wand changed masters only when its previous master was defeated, whether by force in open combat or by cunning in some quieter contest of wills, disarmed or beaten and made to yield the wand itself. Dumbledore had not fallen in a duel for the Elder Wand. He had been struck down afterward, his death arranged rather than won from him in combat over the wand's ownership, and so the true chain of allegiance had already been broken elsewhere, weeks earlier. In a moment, nobody watching the war from the outside had thought worth noticing. On the same tower, before the curse that ended Dumbledore's life was ever cast, a frightened young man named Draco Malfoy had disarmed the old headmaster, wand flying from Dumbledore's hand into Draco's. It was a small, desperate act in the middle of a night gone entirely wrong, and Draco himself had no notion of what he had actually won in that instant. But the wand did not care about intentions or understanding. By the old and unbending logic that governed such things, the Elder Wand's true allegiance had passed to Draco in that single moment of disarming, and it had never belonged to Dumbledore again, tomb or no tomb, death or no death. The man who now carried it from the marble tomb certain he held the one weapon that could never fail him. Held instead a wand that had never truly agreed to serve him at all. He could not have known this. Nothing in the wand's behavior in his hand would have told him so. Not yet. Not while it still answered his commands well enough to seem obedient. The war around him widened in the meantime, indifferent to secrets not yet uncovered. Hogwarts itself drew closer to a battle that would eventually be fought within its own walls and across its grounds. And far from any castle, 3 young people, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, moved from place to place across the country, sleeping in tents and abandoned rooms, carrying with them the burden of Horcruxes still to be found and still to be destroyed. Hunted by forces that answered to the very man who now believed himself, at last, unbeatable. Up next, in Chapter 19, the soul too torn to feel will uncover. The Elder Wand had been drawn from the tomb of Albus Dumbledore, its old wood warm in a hand that believed, finally, that no other wand in the world could stand against it. And yet, even as its new master turned it over in the dark, testing its weight, feeling for the power he was certain must now be his without question. 3 young people he had not yet found were still moving through the world with quiet, stubborn purpose, carrying with them the last scattered pieces of a soul that did not know it was still being hunted. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had spent the better part of a year following whispers and half-remembered clues, and by the time the wand changed hands above a grave in Godric's Hollow, 2 more fragments of that broken soul had already been found and broken in turn. The golden cup that had once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, small and gleaming and etched with a badger along its side, had been kept in the deepest vault of Gringotts Bank, behind a door that answered to Bellatrix Lestrange alone, guarded by charms designed to multiply and burn anything that dared to touch what did not belong to it. Getting to it had cost the 3 of them nearly everything. A desperate escape on the back of a blind and half-wild dragon kept chained beneath the bank for exactly this purpose. Wings beating against sunlight it had not felt in years. But the cup came out with them, and not long after, it was destroyed, pierced through by a fang drawn from the body of a basilisk long dead beneath the castle. The poison inside that fang, undoing the dark magic the same way it had undone a diary many years before. A wisp of shadow rose from the cup as it broke, twisted once in the air, and was gone. And with it went one more anchor that had held a soul to the world of the living against its will. The 6th piece was closer to home than any of the others, waiting inside the walls of Hogwarts itself, hidden in a room that only revealed itself to those who truly needed it and who understood, in their heart, exactly what they were looking for. The lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, believed for centuries to be nothing more than a story parents told their children, a crown said to grant wisdom to whoever wore it, had been tucked away inside the room of requirement by its master decades before, hidden among the accumulated clutter of 1,000 students who had used that same room to conceal their own small secrets. It was found at last among towering shelves of forgotten and forbidden things, resting where it had waited quietly through every year of Harry's schooling without his ever knowing it was there. But the finding of it did not end simply. A boy named Vincent Crabbe, desperate and frightened and reckless in the chaos of that final night, called up a fire that was never meant to be tamed by anyone who summoned it in fear rather than mastery. A living, hungry blaze known as fiendfire that took the shape of serpents and beasts of prey and devoured everything in its path, wood and stone and the diadem itself, along with nearly the 3 friends who had come to destroy it. The diadem burned in that fire until nothing of it remained, and the last of the fragments hidden deliberately by its maker was gone from the world. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet after so much fire and flight, to consider what all of this destruction actually meant, and what it had cost the man who caused it to be necessary in the first place. A soul, whole and healthy, is not a thing that can be cut into pieces without consequence, no matter how carefully or deliberately the cutting is done. 6 times, driven by a fear of death so complete that it reshaped everything else about him, Voldemort had torn his own soul apart and hidden the pieces away in objects he judged safe: a diary, a ring, a locket, a cup, a diadem, and, once, briefly and by accident of circumstance, a snake that traveled everywhere at his side. Each tearing had been an act of violence turned inward as much as outward, because to split a soul is to wound the very thing that makes a person capable of feeling anything at all beyond hunger and want. It is why, long before his body was destroyed and rebuilt, before the diary or the ring or any of the objects existed, those who studied him as a boy already sensed something missing in him, some capacity other children seemed to carry without effort that he did not carry at all. But whatever thin thread of it he had once possessed, that division cut cleanly through. A person with 6 pieces missing from what should have been one whole and unified soul cannot love the way an unbroken person loves, because love asks something of a soul that a soul so thoroughly divided no longer has to give. He could not feel real remorse for what he had done, not the searing, unbearable kind of remorse that claws at a person from the inside and asks something terrible of them in return. He could not feel the small, ordinary empathy that lets one person wince at another's pain as though it were partly their own. What remained inside him, the 7th piece, the smallest sliver still lodged in his own chest, was not enough to carry those things any longer. It could carry ambition, it could carry cunning and cruelty, and a will that did not bend. But it could not carry warmth, and in the end, the 6 pieces scattered so carefully across the world to keep him safe from death were the very same pieces that had made him, by any ordinary measure, less alive than the students sleeping soundly in their beds at Hogwarts that very night. And there was one piece left still to reckon with, one that had never been placed inside an object at all, because it had never been placed anywhere on purpose. On the night in Godric's Hollow, when a curse rebounded and tore his body apart, something more than his physical form had broken loose in that nursery. A fragment of soul, torn free by the violence of that failed killing, had nowhere else to go, and so it had gone, unnoticed by absolutely everyone, into the only living thing close enough to receive it, the boy left crying in the wreckage of his cot, marked forever after by a scar shaped like a bolt of lightning. Harry Potter had carried a piece of Voldemort inside him for very nearly all his life, unknowing, unchosen. A 7th Horcrux never meant to exist and never meant to be found. It explained things that had puzzled him for years, the strange sense of connection to his enemy's thoughts, the whispered parcel tongue that came to him as easily as English. And it meant something far heavier than mere strangeness. For Voldemort to ever be whole again, for his soul to knit back together into something a single body could safely hold, that final fragment would somehow have to return to him, which meant, in the plainest and most terrible terms, that the boy who carried it would have to die. None of this was known yet to the man holding the Elder Wand above a broken tomb, who believed only that victory was now simply a matter of time and force. And so, with that belief burning in him like the only warmth he had left, he began to call his war to its final battlefield. Word went out across hidden places and locked doors, and the Death Eaters came, and the Dementors came gliding cold and silent behind them. And from the mountains and forests where they had waited for a reason to march, the giants came too. gathering at last beneath the towers of Hogwarts as the castle's lights burned on, unaware of how little time remained before the darkness reached its gates. Up next in Chapter 20, the quiet station at the end. We'll uncover. Picture the castle as night settles fully over it, its towers lit not by starlight now, but by spellfire. Its lake reflecting flashes of green and red and gold. The siege of Hogwarts had begun in earnest, and every soul who loved that place, students barely of age, professors who had taught there for decades, members of an old order sworn long ago to resist this very hour, had taken up position along its walls. Giants strode through the dark beyond the boundary. Spiders came from the forest in their thousands, and against them stood witches and wizards, and stranger allies too, centaurs loosing arrows into the night sky, house elves slipping between the legs of giants. A great and ancient magic rising from the stones of the castle itself, as though Hogwarts were waking to defend its own children. It was chaos, and it was courage, and it went on for hours that felt, to those living through them, like no time at all and like an eternity together. Somewhere in the middle of that long and terrible night, in a small dusty boat shed by the great lake, one death occurred that would matter more than almost any other, though it happened quietly, away from the roar of battle, witnessed by almost no one at all. Severus Snape, headmaster of Hogwarts in that year, a man whose loyalties had been doubted and debated for longer than most of the children fighting that night had been alive, was summoned there by the very master he appeared, on the surface, to serve. Lord Voldemort believed, in that hour, that he required one final thing before his victory could be made complete, and he believed that Severus Snape stood in the way of it, however faithful the man had always seemed. And so, without warmth or hesitation, he ordered his great serpent forward, and Nagini struck. Snape did not die at once. He lay upon the dusty floor of that shed as his life left him in slow, dark drops, and into that failing space stepped a boy who had followed, drawn by instinct and by something he could not yet name, wanting answers before it was too late to receive them. And Severus Snape, in the last moments given to him, did something he had done for nobody else in all his life. He gathered his memories, silver and shining, and gave them freely, asking only to be looked at, just once, directly, by eyes so much like the ones he had loved and lost so long ago. What those memories showed, when they were later poured out and entered like water, was the whole hidden shape of a man the world had almost entirely misunderstood. They showed a boy who had loved a girl named Lily since before either of them understood what a wizard or a witch even was. A love that never left him, not through her marriage to another, not through years of serving a master who despised such feeling, not even after her death, which he had unwittingly helped bring about, and which broke something in him that never mended. They showed a lifetime spent atoning in silence, protecting from the shadows a son who did not know he was protected, watching over a boy whose face carried his mother's eyes. And they showed one final truth, delivered not in cruelty, but in sorrow, that the boy himself, Harry, carried within him an unintended fragment of the very soul that had tried to kill him as an infant, lodged there without either of them ever choosing it. For Voldemort to be truly ended, that fragment would have to go, and there was, as far as anyone then understood, only one way for a fragment bound so closely to a living soul to be released, and that was for the body that carried it to die. Harry received this knowledge the way one receives news that has always, somehow, been waited for. He did not rage against it. He did not run from it. He walked instead, slowly and with a settled calm that surprised even those who loved him best, out across the grounds, and into the darkness of the forbidden forest, carrying with him only what he needed to see this through, and leaving behind everyone who would have stopped him if they had known. He understood, by then, that his going was not defeat, that a sacrifice offered freely, out of love, and without resistance, carried a protection stronger than any shield charm or armor. He walked to give himself up, not to lose, but so that something small and dark and clinging that did not belong inside him could finally be torn free. He found Lord Voldemort waiting among the trees, encircled by his followers, and he did not raise his wand. He simply stood and let it happen. The curse came, green and silent and absolute, and for a moment it seemed, to everyone watching from the shadows of the forest, that the boy who had lived now, at last, had not. But there was a stillness after, a stretch of time that belonged to neither the living world nor the dead one, and in it, Harry found himself somewhere very unlike the forest floor. It resembled, in its shape and its light, the great station where he had so many times begun his journeys to school. King's Cross, though this was a version of it washed entirely clean, bright without a sun, silent without being empty, a place built more from feeling than from stone. He was not alone there. In one quiet corner of that vast and gentle place, beneath what might have been a bench, there was something small and huddled, something that flinched from being looked at directly. A raw and stunted little creature, more wound than being, whimpering weakly like an infant left out in the cold. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. It was a fragment of a soul so torn, so repeatedly divided and mishandled across so many years in the pursuit of a life without end, that this was all that remained of it in its truest form. Not a Dark Lord at all, but a small suffering thing, beyond help, beyond comfort, curled in on itself and unable to be approached. It was the clearest picture anyone was ever given of what Voldemort had actually done to himself in his long refusal to accept that all things end. Harry did not stay in that quiet station. He was given, gently and without pressure, a choice, and he chose to go back to the forest floor, back to the noise and grief and unfinished work of the living world, carrying with him the certainty that the thing which had lived inside him since infancy was gone now, left behind in that bright and silent place for good. The battle that followed his return moved quickly toward its close. He returned to a castle still fighting, still grieving its dead, and when the moment came, it came before all of them, in the great hall itself, where so many ordinary days had once begun. Voldemort stood there, believing himself finally unstoppable, believing the wand in his hand, the Elder Wand, ancient and famously unbeaten, would answer only to him. But wands of that kind follow a different kind of loyalty, one built from acts rather than claims, and that wand's true allegiance had already passed, quietly and without ceremony. First to a boy who had disarmed its previous master, and then, in turn, to Harry himself. Voldemort did not know this. He raised his wand, believing it his greatest strength, and Harry, without malice, only told him plainly what was true. The curse Voldemort cast came from a wand that was never truly his to command, and it met, this final time, no shield and no resistance at all. Only the simple fact of what that wand had already decided. It turned back upon the one who cast it, and Lord Voldemort, the last living piece of a soul that had spent a lifetime running from its own ending, fell to the floor of the great hall in front of all those who had fought so long against him and did not rise again. What remained of him there was small and still, far less than the fear he had cast across the wizarding world for so many years, a plain and quiet emptiness where something monstrous had been. And somewhere beyond all of that, in a place with no weather, and no clock, a small huddled shape remained forever where it had been left. Beneath a bench in a bright and silent station, asking nothing more, going nowhere, simply still. The story that began with a boy so afraid of dying that he tore his own soul to pieces to avoid it, ends there, in that quiet, that stillness, that gentle, unbroken silence at the end of every long and difficult road. Let the castle rest now. Let the lake go dark and calm beneath the stars. Let the last of the torches gutter low, one by one, until only the softest light remains, and even that, in time, fades gently into sleep. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed the whole long arc of him, a boy who feared death above all things, the first quiet tearing of a soul, a diary and a ring and a locket gathered one by one. We watched the man unmake himself piece by piece, shed the name he was born with, and rise to master the first great war. We saw the prophecy he chose to believe, and the curse that turned back upon him in a child's small room. We followed the years when he was less than the meanest ghost, the long exile among far northern trees, the face that lived on the back of another man's head, and the first slow clawing back toward a body. We remembered the diary's second life, deep beneath a school, the night of flesh and blood and bone in a dark graveyard, and the strange cold body he wore again. We watched the faithful called home, the hall of whispering prophecies, the wand that promised everything and obeyed him never, the soul by then too torn to feel a single thing, and at the very last, a quiet station at the end of everything, where all his running finally came to rest. There is nothing left now that you must carry. Let each of those old and heavy things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. None of this can touch you, and nothing here asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.